Good evening, my dear friends, and tonight, before the world grows quieter and the edges of thought begin to soften, let us step into a place that many imagine they already understand. A world of stone walls, candlelight, cold corridors, church bells, and stained faces. A world that, from a distance, seems tightly bound by rules, restraint, and silence. A world that appears, at first glance, to leave very little room for private desire at all. It is easy to imagine the Middle Ages this way. In popular imagination, medieval life often appears distant not only in time, but in feeling, as though human experience itself was somehow different there, as though people lived beneath such heavy structures of religion, duty, and hierarchy that intimate life became rare, mechanical, or almost absent altogether. The picture is neat, orderly, and strangely comforting in its simplicity. Rules were strict, we tell ourselves. Society was rigid. Morality was public. Desire must have been hidden away so thoroughly that it barely mattered. And yet, history has a way of becoming less simple the moment you stop looking at it from a distance. Because beneath official rules, beneath sermons, beneath legal codes, beneath all the written instructions that told people how they should live, there remains something that no system has ever fully erased. Human beings. Human beings with bodies, impulses, fears, longings, frustrations, curiosity, and the quiet private contradictions that follow people in every century, no matter what clothing they wear or what gods they pray to. The deeper one looks into medieval life, the stranger the old assumptions begin to feel. What appears at first like a world of silence slowly begins to shift, and in that shifting, something much more familiar begins to emerge. Because medieval people were not creatures of stone and doctrine. They were not abstractions living inside church law. They were husbands and wives, widows and lovers, servants and nobles, frightened young brides, restless husbands, gossiping neighbors, priests listening to confessions, women exchanging warnings in kitchens, men making jokes in taverns, families watching one another closely, communities whispering things they would never say aloud in public. And once you begin to see that, the silence starts to crack. Part of the misunderstanding comes from the kinds of voices history preserves most easily. Official records speak loudly. Laws survive. Religious teachings survive. Moral instruction survives. Sermons survive. Lists of sins survive. Rules about what must not happen survive in extraordinary detail. These voices create a very particular impression, one that feels authoritative and complete. They tell us what was permitted. They tell us what was forbidden. They tell us what was expected. And because these voices speak with such certainty, it is tempting to imagine that people simply lived exactly as instructed, that medieval life unfolded according to written rules, neatly and obediently, as though human behavior could be organized like lines on parchment. But rules, as history repeatedly reminds us, are often evidence not of perfect control, but of repeated struggle. People do not write endless rules about things that never happen. They write rules about things that happen often enough to worry them. And this is where the medieval world begins to reveal itself differently. Because behind every warning, there is a fear. Behind every prohibition, there is a behavior someone is trying to restrain. Behind every sermon, there is an audience already wrestling with the thing being condemned. This is not because medieval society lacked morality, nor because religion held no power. It held immense power. Reputation mattered deeply. Sin was not an abstract concept, but a terrifying moral reality for many people. Social standing could shape marriage prospects, economic survival, inheritance, even physical safety. People lived under observation, by family, by neighbors, by community, by church, and often by their own conscience. And yet, observation is not the same as control. Human life rarely fits neatly into official expectations. Public behavior can be disciplined while private thought remains unruly. Outward obedience can coexist with inward conflict. A person may kneel in church by day and spend the night wrestling with impulses that no sermon has managed to silence. This gap between appearance and reality, between what was visible and what was lived, is one of the quiet truths that runs beneath medieval society like an underground stream. And if you listen carefully, traces of it are everywhere. Court records sometimes reveal disputes that hint at hidden relationships. Confessions preserve admissions that break the moral image official teachings try to create. Stories, jokes, rumors, legal complaints, whispered accusations, all suggest something historians have learned again and again. People rarely stop being human simply because rules tell them to. Instead, they adapt. They become quieter, more indirect, more cautious. They move desire into shadows, into coded language, into secret arrangements, into silences filled with meaning. This does not make medieval life a world of open freedom. Far from it. In fact, what makes it so fascinating, and sometimes unsettling, is precisely the tension between restriction and persistence. Desire did not dissipate. It learned to live under pressure, and pressure changes everything. In medieval communities, reputation was not a private matter. It belonged partly to others. One person's behavior could affect siblings, marriage prospects, family alliances, business relationships, inheritance, trust. Communities were small enough that memory was long and gossip moved faster than written record. People knew this, which meant that private choices rarely felt entirely private. Even the architecture of daily life reinforced this. Modern people are accustomed to privacy in ways medieval people often were not. Bedrooms as personal sanctuaries, private bathrooms, separate domestic spaces, doors that close not just physically but socially. These are comforts of a much later world. Many medieval households were crowded, shared, laid with generations, servants, workers, children, relatives. Life unfolded in proximity. You slept near others, worked near others, heard others, were overheard by others. Privacy existed, but often in fragments rather than guarantees. And this changed how intimate life unfolded. Moments that modern people imagine as secluded and personal were often shaped by awareness of walls that did not fully isolate, footsteps nearby, household rhythms, shared space. The knowledge that life was never entirely removed from the presence of others. This alone creates a world that feels startlingly unfamiliar. And yet, emotionally, something remains deeply recognizable. Because beneath all these structural differences, medieval people still inhabited bodies. They still felt attraction where it was inconvenient. Still experienced marriages that may have lacked affection. Still struggled with longing, jealousy, frustration, uncertainty, secrecy, temptation, shame, tenderness, disappointment. Still lived in that timeless human place where expectation and feeling do not always match. This is perhaps what makes the subject feel strangely intimate when examined closely. The Middle Ages are often imagined as morally simple, a place where rules clearly shaped life and people accepted their roles with quiet certainty. But simplicity is often a myth created by distance. Up close, the period becomes layered, messier, full of contradictions. A society where official voices demanded restraint, while private realities remained far more complicated. A world where desire could not speak openly, and so learned to whisper. A world where duty and instinct existed side by side, where rules were followed, bent, feared, confessed, broken, repeated, where morality and secrecy were not opposites, but companions moving through the same narrow streets. And this is where our journey truly begins tonight. Because once the illusion of medieval silence begins to fade, something more unsettling comes into view. Not a world without intimacy, but a world where intimacy was never simply personal. A world where marriage, family, inheritance, religion, property, morality, and desire all became entangled in ways that made even the most private moments part of a larger system. And perhaps nowhere does that become clearer than in marriage itself, because what comes next is not a story of romance and candlelight, but of agreements made long before love ever had a chance to speak. Section 2. Marriage is duty, not romance. Now, as the candlelight settles lower and the imagined streets of the medieval world grow quieter around us, let us step into one of the institutions that stood at the center of medieval life, not merely as a personal bond, but as a pillar of social order itself. Marriage, a word that, in the modern mind, often arrives wrapped in ideas of affection, companionship, chemistry, personal choice, perhaps even romance. But in much of the medieval world, marriage did not begin with a feeling. It began with an agreement. And that difference changes everything. To modern ears, this can feel immediately jarring, because we are used to imagining relationships as something built from mutual attraction, shared experience, and personal decision. We imagine two people gradually choosing one another, learning one another, perhaps falling in love before stepping into a life together. But medieval marriage, particularly among families with property, status, or social ambitions, often followed a very different logic. A marriage was not simply about two individuals. It was about households, land, inheritance, alliances, security, stability, future generations. And because of this, the people standing at the center of the marriage were not always the ones who had shaped it. Families arranged unions to secure relationships between lineages, to keep land within predictable boundaries, to strengthen political ties, to improve economic standing, to protect futures in a world where survival often depended on networks rather than personal independence. Marriage was a structure long before it became a relationship, and the couple, in many cases, stepped into something already designed for them. This does not mean that affection never existed in medieval marriages. History is too human for such simple conclusions. Some couples grew close. Some developed tenderness. Some found companionship, even love. But love was not the foundation the institution was built upon. Expectation was. And that creates a very different emotional landscape. Imagine, for a moment, stepping into a relationship where your role is already defined before your feelings are even considered. A husband was expected to be a husband in a socially recognizable way. A wife was expected to be a wife in a socially recognizable way. Their duties were not discovered through mutual negotiation. They were inherited from custom, reinforced by religion, shaped by law, and watched by community. The marriage did not begin as a blank page. It began inside a script. This meant that intimacy, too, was understood differently. Today, intimacy is often imagined as something that emerges from emotional connection, a language between two people, something shaped by trust, conversation, desire, timing, and personal comfort. In medieval marriage, intimacy was not treated primarily as discovery. It was treated as part of the marriage itself. Necessary, expected, functional. A physical union was not simply a private matter between spouses. It was one of the things that made the marriage real in practical and social terms. A ceremony created the public bond, but consummation, in many contexts, completed it. And this meant that what modern people often imagine as deeply personal could become something structured by obligation almost immediately. A couple might enter marriage having spent very little meaningful time alone together. They may know of one another, but not know each other in any intimate emotional sense. They may understand the roles expected of them far better than they understand the person they are about to share life with. And yet, once the formal union was complete, expectation moved quickly. The marriage was not merely symbolic. It was meant to begin functioning. This included the production of children. And children, in medieval society, were not simply the private hope of parents. They were heirs, continuations of family lines, future workers, future inheritors, future links in a chain that society considered essential. The physical relationship between husband and wife therefore existed inside this larger framework. Desire might be present, affection might develop, tenderness might grow, but the structure did not depend on these things. It depended on fulfillment of role. And this is where medieval marriage begins to feel emotionally heavy in ways that modern imagination often overlooks. Because intimacy, in such a system, was not always approached as something that unfolded gradually between two people finding comfort with one another. It could arrive instead as an immediate expectation, a duty built into the marriage itself, not something optional, not something postponed indefinitely until emotional closeness appeared, but something understood as part of the agreement, and that agreement carried weight. For the bride, marriage often marked an abrupt transition into a new life where expectations changed quickly and permanently. She moved not only into a relationship, but into a role: wife, potential mother, manager of household duties, depending on class and circumstance, bearer of family continuity. Her body, her conduct, her fertility, all suddenly mattered in ways connected not only to herself but to an entire network of people and expectations. For the groom, different pressures emerged. He too entered a role already defined. He was expected to establish authority in recognizable ways, to fulfill marital obligations, to continue family lines, to act with certainty inside a structure that assumed he knew how to inhabit it. Personal uncertainty had little space in such expectations. Both individuals, in different ways, were being carried by a system larger than themselves, and that system did not pause to ask whether emotional readiness had arrived. What makes this especially striking is how little privacy medieval domestic life often allowed. A marriage today might unfold inside private apartments, separate bedrooms, quiet emotional space. But medieval households were frequently shared worlds. Multiple generations, servants, workers, children, relatives, thin walls, common sleeping arrangements in some circumstances, domestic life that moved in layers of closeness rather than modern isolation. Even when privacy existed, it was often partial, not absolute. This meant that intimacy was shaped not only by marital expectation, but by environment, awareness of others nearby, shared domestic rhythms, limited separation between personal life and household life. Moments modern people imagine as secluded often unfolded under entirely different practical conditions. And still, the expectations remained, not only from family, not only from community, but from religion, because medieval Christianity did not simply bless marriage and leave it alone. It entered the bedroom too. There were teachings about marital conduct, teachings about appropriate times, teachings about restraint, teachings about purpose, periods in the religious calendar when intimacy might be discouraged, moral frameworks that shaped not only who could marry, but how married life itself was supposed to function. Even within marriage, the couple did not possess the kind of private autonomy modern people often assume. Their intimate life existed inside a larger moral structure, which means something fascinating and difficult begins to emerge. Marriage gave intimacy legitimacy, but it did not necessarily give intimacy freedom. It authorized the act, while surrounding it with duty, expectation, reproductive purpose, religious boundaries, family pressure, and social consequence. And so the marriage bed, which modern imagination often turns into a symbol of romance, could in reality become something much heavier, a place where personal feeling met social obligation, where bodies met expectation, where intimacy was not simply about desire, but about fulfilling a role inside a system designed long before either individual entered it. This does not mean that every medieval marriage was cold or loveless. Human beings remained too unpredictable for that. Some couples undoubtedly found gentleness. Some found patience. Some built affection over time. Some learned one another slowly within the limits they had been given. But the institution itself was not built to guarantee emotional comfort. It was built to preserve order. That distinction matters, because when a society designs marriage primarily as a structure of continuity, emotional closeness becomes something that may happen within it, but not something the system is built around. And this is what makes medieval marriage feel so different from modern romantic expectation. Not because intimacy was absent, but because intimacy was absorbed into duty. Marriage was not first a story of feeling. It was a mechanism of family, property, legitimacy, religion, and social order, with human emotion moving somewhere inside that machinery. And that machinery, powerful as it was, still had limits, because rules, structures, sermons, and marital expectations could shape behavior, but they could not fully control what people continued to feel or do once doors closed and private life began. And that, my dear friends, is where the church enters our story more fully. Because what comes next is not about the rules themselves, but about how even the most powerful moral authority in medieval life could never completely contain human behavior. Section 3. The Church and the Limits of Control. Now, let us move deeper into the medieval world, into the institution that seemed, from nearly every direction, to stand above all others. The Church. Its bells marked time. Its teachings shaped morality. Its rituals accompanied birth, marriage, confession, death. Its authority reached not only into public life, but into private conscience, into thoughts, impulses, actions, even intentions. To modern eyes, this can appear almost overwhelming. A world so shaped by religious authority seems, at first glance, like a world where moral control must have been nearly complete. And perhaps that is why medieval intimacy is so often imagined as something rigidly suppressed, tightly contained beneath doctrine and faith. Because when we picture the medieval church, we picture sermons from pulpits, lists of sins, Stein warnings, confessionals, rules about marriage, rules about conduct, rules about what was permitted and forbidden. We picture a moral system so detailed, so far-reaching, that it seems to leave little room for deviation at all. But hey, as in so many places in history, authority looks simpler from a distance than it does up close, because power can instruct, power can punish, power can influence, power can shape what people say publicly, but power, even religious power, cannot fully enter the private complexity of human behavior. And that is where medieval life becomes far more interesting than the official rules suggest. The church spoke clearly about morality. In many matters, it did not hesitate. There were teachings about marriage, about adultery, about chastity, about sinful thoughts, about bodily conduct, about times when intimacy was appropriate, times when it was discouraged, acts considered acceptable, acts condemned. These were not casual suggestions. They were presented as moral truths, tied not only to behavior but to salvation itself. Sin was not simply bad behavior. It could be spiritually dangerous, a matter of eternal consequence. This gave religious teaching extraordinary psychological power. To live in the medieval Christian world was often to live with a moral imagination shaped by heaven, hell, judgment, repentance, and divine scrutiny. Even when no human eyes were watching, God, people believed, still saw. And that kind of belief reaches deeply into private life. But even so, human beings remained human. And this is the quiet truth that keeps surfacing beneath official morality. Because sermons can warn against temptation, but sermons do not remove temptation. Rules can forbid behavior, but rules do not erase desire. Confession can demand repentance, but repentance does not guarantee that behavior never happens again. And so, beneath the visible moral order, another reality moved quietly. A reality made of compromises, rationalizations, secrecy, failures, negotiations between belief and behavior. Not open rebellion, necessarily. Not a society constantly rejecting religious authority. Something subtler than that. A world where people often believed in the rules, respected the rules, feared the consequences of breaking the rules, and yet did not always live within them perfectly. This is where the medieval church becomes especially fascinating, because one of the clearest glimpses into this hidden private world comes from one of the church's own mechanisms of control: confession. Confession was meant to restore moral order. A person admitted sins, received guidance, repented, returned to spiritual discipline. It was, in theory, a tool of correction. But in practice, confession also preserved something else, evidence of how often human behavior drifted beyond the rules. And when historians look at the kinds of sins people confessed, what emerges is not a picture of perfect obedience. It is a picture of struggle, repeated struggle, private struggle, people wrestling not only with actions, but with thoughts, temptations, desires, intentions, memories, things done in secret, things regretted, things repeated despite regret. This matters because it changes the image entirely. A society producing endless warnings about sexual morality is not necessarily a society where no one acts outside those boundaries. It may instead be a society where those boundaries are being crossed often enough that moral instruction must keep returning to them. Again, and again, and again. This does not make medieval life morally lax. It makes it human. A priest could hear confessions, offer correction, assign penance, remind a person of sin, but he could not re-engineer human nature. He could not remove loneliness, or desire, or frustration inside unhappy marriages, or attraction that arrived in the wrong place, or impulses that appeared despite sincere religious commitment. And so a cycle emerged. Rules, behavior, confession, penance, renewed effort, failure again, another confession, a quiet rhythm of moral aspiration and human imperfection. This is perhaps far more recognizable than we expect, because even in highly structured societies, people rarely live as abstractions. They live as conflicted beings, trying, failing, justifying, repenting, trying again. The Church knew this, of course. That is partly why its moral language became so detailed. But detail is not the same as control. And here another layer of medieval life becomes visible. Public compliance, private complexity. People lived in communities where reputation mattered enormously. To be seen as moral was socially valuable. To be suspected of impropriety could damage standing, family relations, marriage prospects, trust, which meant that outward behavior often reflected expected norms, even when inner life did not. A person might appear obedient in public, while privately living with thoughts, desires, relationships, or actions that told a more complicated story. This created something almost theatrical in medieval social life. Not necessarily hypocrisy in the simple modern sense, but layered existence. A public self shaped by expectation, a private self shaped by lived reality. And because communities were small, tightly connected, observant, people learned to navigate this carefully. Silence became a skill. Discretion became survival. Things were known, but not openly acknowledged. Rumors circulated in whispers rather than proclamations. People maintained appearances not because appearances were always true, but because appearances mattered. The Church itself, powerful though it was, existed inside this same human world. And this is where history becomes quietly ironic. Institutions built to embody discipline were not magically separate from human behavior. Monasteries, clergy, religious communities, all existed inside the same species-wide reality of impulse, frailty, contradiction, secrecy, temptation, and imperfect obedience. Records from various times and places reveal that religious institutions, too, were not untouched by the gap between rule and reality, which reminds us of something important. No system, however sacred, eliminates human complexity. It can organize it, shape it, judge it, punish it, channel it, but not erase it. And perhaps this is why medieval society begins to feel strangely familiar when examined closely. Because the image of absolute control starts dissolving. In its place appears something more recognizable. People living under strong moral authority, trying, in various ways, to align themselves with it, failing in some areas, conforming in others, negotiating private realities behind public order. A world where rules mattered deeply, and yet rules were never the whole story. This does not weaken the Church's importance. In fact, it reveals its true role more clearly. The church did not create a world of perfect obedience. It created a moral framework inside which human behavior unfolded, sometimes in alignment, sometimes in conflict, often somewhere in between. And that in between is where much of real life lived. That is where secrecy grew, where compromise emerged, where behavior moved quietly beneath official language, where people learned how to inhabit moral systems without becoming perfectly shaped by them. And this creates a tension that runs through the entire medieval world. Authority on one side, human experience on the other, neither fully defeating the other. Instead, constantly pressing against one another. Rules creating pressure, pressure creating secrecy, secrecy creating hidden behavior creating more rules. A cycle that never quite resolves. And perhaps this is where something even stranger begins to happen. Because when a society watches desire so closely, names it so often, regulates it so intensely, desire does not vanish. It becomes more present in unexpected ways, more watched, more discussed indirectly, more embedded in rumor, humor, confession, anxiety, metaphor, warning, a thing hidden, yet never absent. And that, my dear friends, leads us toward a surprising truth. Because what comes next is not about a society that successfully suppressed desire, but about a society that became quietly, persistently, almost obsessively aware of it. Section 4. A society quietly obsessed with desire. Now, let us move into one of the stranger contradictions of the medieval world, one that feels almost paradoxical when first encountered. Because common imagination tells us that repression creates absence, that strict moral systems push sighted subjects so far into silence that they simply fade from daily life, that if a society forbids something strongly enough, condemns it often enough, surrounds it with shame, fear, warning, and religious scrutiny, then eventually that subject must retreat into near invisibility. But history, as it so often does, refuses to behave so neatly, because in the medieval world, the closer one looks, the clearer it becomes that restriction did not erase desire. It transformed it, and in some curious ways, it made people more aware of it, not less. This may seem counterintuitive at first. How could a society so focused on restraint become quietly preoccupied with the very thing it sought to regulate? The answer lies in something deeply human. What is watched constantly, rarely disappears from consciousness. What is named repeatedly, remains mentally present. What is feared, warned against, categorized, confessed, punished, joked about, whispered about, monitored, and morally examined, does not simply vanish. It becomes part of the psychological atmosphere, not openly displayed, not freely celebrated, but present, persistent, lingering at the edges of thought. And this is one of the quiet truths of medieval life. Desire did not disappear beneath moral pressure. It became something people thought about in more indirect, more coded, and sometimes more concentrated ways. Religious teaching played a major role in this. The church did not merely say moral in broad abstract terms. It often addressed intimate conduct with remarkable specificity. What was acceptable? What was sinful? What thoughts mattered? What acts crossed boundaries? What intentions counted? What times were permitted? What circumstances altered moral meaning? All of this required attention. And attention changes a subject. Imagine living in a world where moral reflection does not concern itself only with visible behavior, but with temptation itself. Not merely with actions, but with thoughts. Not simply with what happened, but with what almost happened. This creates a very particular mental landscape. Desire becomes something to monitor internally. A person must notice it, evaluate it, resist it, confess it if necessary, classify it morally. And in doing so, the subject remains active in consciousness. Even silence does not erase it. In some ways, silence sharpens it. Confession reveals this particularly clearly, because confession did not concern itself only with public scandal or obvious wrongdoing. It could reach inward, toward memory, thought, temptation, intention, private acts, things no one else knew. This meant that individuals were often asked not merely to behave morally, but to examine themselves morally in detail, to revisit moments, to describe failures, to identify temptation, to name what had occurred privately. This process, meant to regulate desire, also ensured that desire remained psychologically visible. A person might suppress outward expression, yet inwardly carry the subject through reflection, guilt, memory, anticipation, fear. In this way, restriction did not produce blankness. It produced awareness under pressure, and this awareness extended beyond religious settings. Daily life carried its own quieter forms of recognition. Humor, for example, tells us much about societies. People joke about what they collectively understand. They joke about tensions too awkward to discuss directly. They joke about things that carry social charge. And medieval humor, in many places and contexts, reveals that intimate matters were hardly unknown or unimagined. Jokes could approach what formal speech avoided. A tavern remark, a sly reference, a story whose meaning everyone understood without needing explicit explanation. Laughter often became a safe corridor for acknowledging things that propriety required people to keep indirect. And humor matters because it shows shared awareness. A joke only works when listeners understand what lies beneath it, which means that beneath the surface of formal morality, people often carried common knowledge of the very subjects official discourse tried to regulate. Rumor played a similar role. In tightly connected communities, information moved in curious ways, not always accurately, not always fairly, but persistently. Whispers about relationships, suspicions, stories, hints, private behavior becoming public speculation, half-known truths traveling through kitchens, market stalls, workshops, courtyards. In such a world, desire was not absent. It was socially tracked, often through indirect channels, not openly discussed in formal language, but circulating through community awareness. And rumor carries a strange psychological effect. It keeps a subject alive without fully naming it. It creates presence through suggestion, something everyone knows, and no one says plainly. This indirectness appears in language itself. Formal discourse often avoided blunt expression, but metaphor, coded references, symbolic language, suggestive imagery, these allowed ideas to travel beneath the surface. Meaning could be communicated without complete directness. People learned to hear what was implied, to understand references without explicit explanation, to inhabit a world where speech carried layers. This is not unusual in restrictive societies. Indirect language becomes a way of speaking safely, but it also means the supposedly hidden subject remains culturally present, not erased, refracted. Even physical living conditions reinforced this heightened awareness. Modern privacy allows many things to remain invisible simply because they occur in isolation. Medieval life often did not offer such isolation. People lived close to one another, heard things, noticed absences, saw who lingered where, watched patterns, observed interactions, interpreted glances. In close communities, knowledge did not always require direct evidence. Awareness grew from proximity, and in such settings, desire, relationships, attraction, impropriety, intimacy, all could become part of collective social consciousness even when never openly acknowledged. This creates an important distinction. Suppression is not the same as disappearance. Suppression often changes where a thing lives. Instead of open expression, it moves into coded spaces, into rumor, into confession, into moral instruction, into metaphor, into private thought, into nervous humor, into social suspicion, into whispered warnings. And there, paradoxically, it may become even more psychologically charged, because what is both hidden and constantly watched acquires tension. It becomes heavier, more concentrated, less casual, more symbolically loaded. and this tension ran through medieval life in quiet but powerful ways. On the surface, order. Beneath the surface, awareness. Public restraint. Private thought. Formal silence. Informal understanding. Rules everywhere. Desire still present, moving through smaller channels. This is perhaps why the medieval world begins to feel so different once one stops imagining it as emotionally simple. It was not a blank landscape where desire had been extinguished. It was a landscape where desire had been disciplined, redirected, moralized, watched, fed, joked about, confessed, whispered about, and woven into systems of social control. And in that process, it became something people could not easily ignore. A hidden subject, always near the surface. A silence, full of meaning. A restraint, charged with awareness. And perhaps this is what makes the period feel quietly unsettling when viewed closely. Because the more intensely something is controlled, the more traces of that control begin to reveal how deeply people were thinking about the very thing they claimed to restrain. What appears from a distance like moral simplicity becomes, up close, a culture of layered tension, a world where desire did not speak loudly, but was never entirely absent from thought, never entirely absent from faith, never entirely absent from humor, never entirely absent from social life. And as that tension builds, it begins to lead us somewhere even more intimate and more difficult, because restriction is one thing in theory, but when it enters the marriage bed itself, when expectation becomes physical, when private experience is shaped by public obligation, the story grows heavier, and nowhere is that weight felt more sharply than on the wedding night. Section 5. The Wedding Night. Now, let us step into one of the most intimate moments in medieval life, and perhaps one of the most misunderstood, the wedding night. Modern imagination often paints it softly, a private room, a quiet beginning. Two people crossing gently into a shared life, an evening shaped by nervous affection, tenderness, discovery, perhaps even romance. It is a picture familiar from stories, warm with candlelight and symbolic closeness. But the medieval reality, in many cases, was something far heavier, because a wedding night in the Middle Ages was not simply the beginning of a relationship. It was the completion of an agreement, a public arrangement, now expected to become physically real and private, and that expectation carried enormous weight. The ceremony might be over, the blessings spoken, the vows witnessed, families satisfied, celebration completed, but in a very practical sense, something essential was still expected to happen. The marriage, in many contexts, was not considered complete merely because words had been spoken before witnesses. It had to be consummated. The physical union mattered, not symbolically, not poetically, practically, socially, legally, religiously. And once this is understood, the emotional atmosphere of the wedding night begins to feel very different indeed. Because what modern people often imagine as a personal moment between two individuals was, in medieval society, frequently a moment carrying significance far beyond the room itself. Families cared about it. Inheritance depended on it. Legitimacy connected to it. Future children would emerge from it. The social machinery of marriage moved through it. This meant that the wedding night was not simply private, even when doors closed. It carried witnesses in absence, expectations in silence, invisible pressure sitting in the room with the couple. For many brides, this moment arrived not through gradual emotional intimacy, but suddenly, as part of a transition into a role. A daughter became a wife, and with that change came immediate expectations about what marriage now required. Knowledge about the body was not always openly explained. Many young women entered marriage with fragments of understanding, warnings, half-spoken advice, stories whispered rather than clearly taught. The body was discussed indirectly. Preparation often came not through knowledge, but through caution, through anticipation, through faith, through silence. This created a peculiar emotional landscape. A bride might know that something was expected, Know that marriage changed everything. Know that this night mattered enormously, and yet still not possess the kind of personal understanding modern people take for granted. Not because medieval women lacked intelligence, but because knowledge itself was often uneven, controlled, partial, transmitted in indirect ways. And so the wedding night could arrive with a kind of quiet dread, not always spoken aloud, but present. A threshold that had to be crossed, a role that had to begin, a moment that belonged not only to oneself, but to family expectation and social consequence. For the groom, the pressures were different, but no less real. He too stepped into a role already defined. He was expected to act with certainty, to complete what marriage required, to demonstrate capability, to establish himself in the marital role in ways society recognized. Hesitation had little place in the script. Personal nervousness, if it existed, had to remain secondary to performance. And so too individuals, who may scarcely know one another in any emotionally meaningful sense, entered a deeply intimate moment already carrying social expectations larger than themselves. This alone changes the emotional tone completely. What modern imagination often treats as discovery, medieval society often treated as obligation. Not optional, not gradual, not indefinitely postponed until emotional comfort emerged. Something that had to happen, and quickly. The physical environment added yet another layer of pressure. Medieval households were rarely the private, insulated domestic spaces familiar to modern life. Homes could be crowded, walls thin, relatives nearby, servants close, household rhythms shared, noise carried, awareness lingered. Even where couples were given a room, privacy was often practical rather than absolute. Others knew what was expected. That knowledge mattered. Imagine, for a moment, trying to experience a profoundly intimate encounter while remaining aware that an entire household understands what is supposed to occur, perhaps waiting, perhaps quietly noting, perhaps discussing it later in whispers. The room may be physically enclosed, but socially, it is not entirely isolated. Expectation presses inward from outside, and in some circumstances, the pressure became even more explicit. Certain local customs, varying across time and place, attached symbolic importance to proof of consummation or to evidence of virginity. Not every marriage involved direct public verification, and customs differed widely, but the possibility alone reveals something important. The wedding night was not understood purely as a private emotional experience. It could become a matter of social confirmation, a fact with consequences, a step in establishing legitimacy, something whose outcome mattered beyond the couple themselves. And once again, what modern people imagine as personal becomes part of a larger structure. The physical experience itself could be difficult in ways rarely acknowledged in romantic imagination. Without clear preparation, without open communication, without gradual emotional intimacy, without modern expectations of negotiation or mutual pacing, the encounter could be awkward, painful, confusing, emotionally unsettling. Not necessarily because cruelty was intended, but because the system itself prioritized completion over comfort. This is an important distinction. The medieval institution of marriage did not ask first, how do these two people feel? It asked, has the marriage been fulfilled? Has the union begun? Can heirs follow? Has the agreement become physically real? Comfort, tenderness, mutual understanding. These may have existed in individual marriages, but they were not what the system was built to guarantee. And this absence of guaranteed emotional space changes everything. Modern perspectives often center communication. Consent is ongoing dialogue, mutual readiness, gradual intimacy, personal emotional pacing. The wedding night, in modern imagination, is ideally something approached together. But medieval marriage often operated from a different premise. The act itself was considered part of the marriage contract, not something separately negotiated from within it. That does not mean every couple experienced it the same way. Human beings never fit so uniformly into historical structures. Some husbands may have been patient. Some brides may have entered marriage with more understanding. Some couples may have already developed familiarity. Some marriages may have unfolded gently. History always contains variation. But the institution itself, the system, did not build itself around emotional negotiation. It built itself around expectation. And that expectation made the wedding night heavy. Not simply because intimacy occurred, but because intimacy arrived already carrying meaning assigned by others. For families, it signaled continuity. For society, legitimacy. For religion, fulfillment of marital purpose. For inheritance, future possibility. For the couple, a private experience inseparable from public consequence. This creates one of the clearest examples of how medieval life blurred the line between personal and social existence. Something profoundly intimate became structurally important. Something deeply bodily became socially symbolic. Something modern people imagine as emotionally private became, in medieval terms, part of a larger system of proof, order, continuity, and expectation. And perhaps this is what makes the wedding night feel so emotionally different when viewed through historical reality. Not a quiet beginning between two freely choosing lovers in a private emotional world, but a moment under pressure. A threshold weighted with expectation. A night where proof mattered more than tenderness, completion mattered more than comfort, and social meaning entered the bedchamber alongside the couple. Of course, the pressure did not end there, because once marriage began, the scrutiny did not dissipate. In fact, for women especially, the body itself remained under a form of observation that extended far beyond a single night. Because what came next was not merely about intimacy, but about something medieval society treated as a form of value in itself, virginity, and the astonishing amount of social weight that could rest upon it. Section 5. The Wedding Night. Now, let us step into one of the most intimate moments in medieval life, and perhaps one of the most misunderstood, the wedding night. Modern imagination often paints it softly. A private room, a quiet beginning, two people crossing gently into a shared life, an evening shaped by nervous affection, tenderness, discovery, perhaps even romance. It is a picture familiar from stories, warm with candlelight and symbolic closeness. But the medieval reality, in many cases, was something far heavier, because a wedding night in the Middle Ages was not simply the beginning of a relationship. It was the completion of an agreement, a public arrangement, now expected to become physically real in private. And that expectation carried enormous weight. The ceremony might be over, the blessings spoken, the vows witnessed, families satisfied, celebration completed. But in a very practical sense, something essential was still expected to happen. The marriage, in many contexts, was not considered complete merely because words had been spoken before witnesses. It had to be consummated. The physical union mattered, not symbolically, not poetically, practically, socially, legally, religiously. And once this is understood, the emotional atmosphere of the wedding night begins to feel very different indeed. Because what modern people often imagine as a personal moment between two individuals was, in medieval society, frequently a moment carrying significance far beyond the room itself. Families cared about it. Inheritance depended on it. Legitimacy connected to it. Future children would emerge from it. The social machinery of marriage moved through it. This meant that the wedding night was not simply private, even when doors closed. It carried witnesses in absence, expectations in silence, invisible pressure sitting in the room with the couple. For many brides, this moment arrived not through gradual emotional intimacy, but suddenly, as part of a transition into a role. A daughter became a wife, and with that change came immediate expectations about what marriage now required. Knowledge about the body was not always openly explained. Many young women entered marriage with fragments of understanding, warnings, half-spoken advice, stories whispered rather than clearly taught. The body was discussed indirectly. Preparation often came not through knowledge, but through caution. through anticipation, through faith, through silence. This created a peculiar emotional landscape. A bride might know that something was expected, know that marriage changed everything, know that this night mattered enormously, and yet still not possess the kind of personal understanding modern people take for granted. Not because medieval women lacked intelligence, but because knowledge itself was often uneven, controlled, partial, transmitted in indirect ways. And so the wedding night could arrive with a kind of quiet dread, not always spoken aloud, but present, a threshold that had to be crossed, a role that had to begin, a moment that belonged not only to oneself, but to family expectation and social consequence. For the groom, the pressures were different, but no less real. He too stepped into a role already defined. He was expected to act with certainty, to complete what marriage required, to demonstrate capability, to establish himself in a marital role in ways society recognized. Hesitation had little place in the script. Personal nervousness, if it existed, had to remain secondary to performance. And so two individuals, who may scarcely know one another in any emotionally meaningful sense, entered a deeply intimate moment already carrying social expectations larger than themselves. This alone changes the emotional tone completely. What modern imagination often treats as discovery, medieval society often treated as obligation. Not optional, not gradual, not indefinitely postponed until emotional comfort emerged. Something that had to happen, and quickly. The physical environment added yet another layer of pressure. Medieval households were rarely the private, insulated domestic spaces familiar to modern life. Homes could be crowded, walls thin, relatives nearby, servants close, household rhythms shared, noise carried, awareness lingered. Even where couples were given a room, privacy was often practical rather than absolute. Others knew what was expected. That knowledge mattered. Imagine, for a moment, trying to experience a profoundly intimate encounter while remaining aware that an entire household understands what is supposed to occur, perhaps waiting, perhaps quietly noting, perhaps discussing it later in whispers. The room may be physically enclosed, but socially, it is not entirely isolated. Expectation presses inward from outside, and in some circumstances, the pressure became even more explicit. Certain local customs, varying across time and place, attached symbolic importance to proof of consummation or to evidence of virginity. Not every marriage involved direct public verification, and customs differed widely, but the possibility alone reveals something important. The wedding night was not understood purely as a private emotional experience. It could become a matter of social confirmation, a fact with consequences, a step in establishing legitimacy, something whose outcome mattered beyond the couple themselves. And once again, what modern people imagine as personal becomes part of a larger structure. The physical experience itself could be difficult in ways rarely acknowledged in romantic imagination. Without clear preparation, without open communication, without gradual emotional intimacy, without modern expectations of negotiation or mutual pacing, the encounter could be awkward, painful, confusing, emotionally unsettling, not necessarily because cruelty was intended, but because the system itself prioritized completion over comfort. This is an important distinction. The medieval institution of marriage did not ask first, how do these two people feel? It asked, has the marriage been fulfilled? Has the union begun? Can heirs follow? Has the agreement become physically real? Comfort, tenderness, mutual understanding. These may have existed in individual marriages, but they were not what the system was built to guarantee. And this absence of guaranteed emotional space changes everything. Modern perspectives often center communication. Consent is ongoing dialogue, mutual readiness, gradual intimacy, personal emotional pacing. The wedding night, in modern imagination, is ideally something approached together, but medieval marriage often operated from a different premise. The act itself was considered part of the marriage contract, not something separately negotiated from within it. That does not mean every couple experienced it the same way. Human beings never fit so uniformly into historical structures. Some husbands may have been patient. Some brides may have entered marriage with more understanding. Some couples may have already developed familiarity. Some marriages may have unfolded gently. History always contains variation. But the institution itself, the system, did not build itself around emotional negotiation. It built itself around expectation. And that expectation made the wedding night heavy. Not simply because intimacy occurred, but because intimacy arrived already carrying meaning assigned by others. For families, it signaled continuity. For society, legitimacy. For religion, fulfillment of marital purpose. For inheritance, future possibility. For the couple, a private experience inseparable from public consequence. This creates one of the clearest examples of how medieval life blurred the line between personal and social existence. Something profoundly intimate became structurally important. Something deeply bodily became socially symbolic. Something modern people imagine as emotionally private became, in medieval terms, part of a larger system of proof, order, continuity, and expectation. And perhaps this is what makes the wedding night feel so emotionally different when viewed through historical reality. Not a quiet beginning between two freely choosing lovers in a private emotional world, but a moment under pressure, a threshold weighted with expectation, a night where proof mattered more than tenderness, completion mattered more than comfort, and social meaning entered the bedchamber alongside the couple. Of course, the pressure did not end there. Because once marriage began, the scrutiny did not dissipate. In fact, for women especially, the body itself remained under a form of observation that extended far beyond a single night. Because what came next was not merely about intimacy, but about something medieval society treated as a form of value in itself, virginity, and the astonishing amount of social weight that could rest upon it. Section 6. Virginity and social value. Now, let us move into another deeply revealing part of medieval life, one that, to modern minds, can feel at once intensely personal and strangely public. Virginity. Today, many people think of virginity as something private, a matter of personal experience, individual belief, or intimate history. But in much of the medieval world, it was not understood primarily as private at all. It was treated as social value, a condition believed to carry meaning far beyond the person herself, a state that could affect reputation, marriage prospects, family honor, economic security, inheritance, trust, and the standing of entire households. And once we understand this, something unsettling begins to emerge, because what might seem, in another context, like an individual matter became, in medieval society, part of a much larger system of control. A young woman's body was not viewed simply as her own private reality. It existed inside a network of expectations. Family expectations, community expectations, marital expectations, economic expectations, religious expectations. And these expectations gave virginity a kind of social weight that could shape a life long before marriage ever began. This was not abstract moral language floating above daily reality. It had practical consequences. A family's reputation could influence alliances, marriage negotiations, security, standing within a community, future opportunities. And because marriage itself was tied so closely to property, inheritance, legitimacy, and family continuity, the status of a daughter entering marriage mattered enormously. Virginity became part of what signaled order, control, predictability, certainty, a sign, in the eyes of society, that boundaries had been maintained and that marriage could proceed without doubt attached to the woman or the family around her. And so, something intensely bodily became socially symbolic. The consequences of this could be immense. Families did not merely hope their daughters would remain virtuous in the abstract moral sense. They often had practical reasons to guard reputation carefully, because in tightly connected communities, accusation alone could wound. Even suspicion, even rumor, even the suggestion of impropriety could alter how a young woman was seen. And once reputation shifted in such communities, restoring it could be difficult. Memory was long. Gossip moved quickly. Stories, whether true or not, did not vanish easily. This meant that the pressure surrounding virginity was not simply about physical reality. It was about perception, about what others believed, about what could be suspected, about what could be said. A family might guard not only against impropriety itself, but against situations that looked improper, because in medieval society, appearance could carry consequences almost as powerful as fact. This creates a world of subtle and constant vigilance, interactions monitored, movement restricted, time spent alone with unrelated men carefully limited in many contexts, opportunities for unsupervised contact reduced, visits observed, household structures arranged around caution, not always harshly, not always with explicit cruelty. Sometimes these measures were framed as care, protection, prudence, parental responsibility, but whatever language surrounded them, the effect was often the same. A young woman's freedom of movement and interaction existed inside a web of watchfulness. Her body was understood as carrying value not only for herself, but for others. And that distinction changes everything. Because once a body becomes linked to family reputation and economic stability, it ceases to be treated as purely personal. It becomes symbolic property in a social sense, something to preserve, protect, monitor, manage, not simply because of moral ideals, but because of consequences believed to extend outward into family life. This is perhaps one of the most emotionally difficult aspects of medieval gendered experience. The burden of maintaining this form of social honor fell heavily and unevenly. Men were not entirely free from moral expectations. Certainly, male behavior could be judged. Male misconduct could attract criticism. But the consequences were often structured differently. A young woman's perceived sexual status could alter marriage prospects in immediate, concrete ways, could affect dowries, negotiations, family trust, social standing, could shape how she was spoken about long after the fact. This imbalance created a system in which female behavior became subject to closer scrutiny, stricter interpretation, heavier consequence. And here, once again, rumor becomes one of the most powerful forces in medieval social life. Because rumor does not require proof. It thrives in uncertainty. A glance noticed, a meeting misinterpreted, a delayed return home, an overheard comment, a whispered suggestion, a story repeated enough times that it begins to feel like truth. In close communities, this could be devastating. A reputation might suffer not because something happened, but because people believed something might have happened. This meant that virginity was not merely a bodily condition in the medieval imagination. It was social belief, social trust, social narrative, a status partly constructed through what others accepted as true. And because of this, families often responded with caution that could feel relentless. Protective chaperoning, restrictions on private encounters, watchfulness over correspondence, meetings, social opportunities, attention to how a daughter was seen in public, not simply what she did, but how she appeared. The distinction matters, because medieval systems of honor were built not only on reality, but on perception, and perception can become its own form of control. Certain wedding night expectations reinforced this logic further. In some contexts, customs surrounding virginity or symbolic proof carried social meaning, again varying by region and time. These practices were not universal, nor identical across medieval Europe, but the very existence of such concerns tells us something essential. Virginity was not left entirely in the realm of private assumption. It could become something discussed, examined indirectly, expected, symbolically confirmed. Its significance extended outward, and behind all of this, there was another practical concern: inheritance. Because medieval marriage was not merely about companionship, it was about lineage, and lineage required certainty. If a bride entered marriage understood to be sexually untouched, society believed this helped secure confidence that future children belonged unquestionably within the marriage and therefore within inheritance structures. Again, what appears moral on the surface often carries economic and legal logic beneath it. Virginity helped support legitimacy. Legitimacy supported inheritance. Inheritance supported social order. And so a woman's body became entangled in systems much larger than herself. Property, land, family continuity, titles, economic stability, social trust. This is why medieval concern over virginity often feels so disproportionate to modern sensibilities, because the concern was not operating only at the level of private morality. It was connected to multiple systems at once: religious ideals, social honor, economic consequence, legal certainty, family reputation. And when several systems reinforce the same expectation, control becomes deeply embedded. Of course, human behavior did not perfectly obey such structures. Young people still formed attachments. Desire still appeared where it should not. Risks were taken. Relationships formed in secrecy. Boundaries were crossed. Rumors proved true sometimes, false at other times. The human story never disappears simply because society demands control. And when these situations emerged, the consequences could be severe. Not only emotionally, but socially. Marriage prospects damaged. Family tensions ignited. Reputation altered. Household conflict deepened, which in turn reinforced the very pressures meant to prevent such outcomes. A cycle of fear, control, secrecy, transgression, consequence, and renewed control. And perhaps this is what makes virginity in the medieval world feel so revealing, because it shows us, with startling clarity, how a society can transform something bodily into something symbolic, how personal experience becomes public meaning, how a woman's intimate status becomes a kind of social currency, tied to systems of family, inheritance, trust, and honor. Virginity was not simply treated as private innocence. It became evidence, value, expectation, a condition watched because too many other things were believed to depend upon it. And yet, beneath all this control, another contradiction waited, because medieval thought did not entirely deny that women experienced desire. In fact, some theories acknowledged it in ways that can seem surprisingly direct. But recognition did not necessarily lead to freedom. Instead, even pleasure itself would be drawn into systems of purpose, explanation, and control. And that, my dear friends, is where our story goes next. Section 7. Female Pleasure in Medieval Theory. Now, let us step into one of the more surprising and complicated corners of medieval thought, a place where modern assumptions often begin to wobble, because it is easy to imagine that medieval society simply denied female desire altogether, that women were seen only as passive participants in intimacy, silent figures in a system concerned exclusively with man, reproduction, and moral control. And yet, the historical reality, as so often happens, is stranger than the simplified version, because some medieval theories did acknowledge that women experienced desire. Some medical ideas even suggested that female physical response played a role in conception itself. And at first glance, this can sound unexpectedly progressive, a surprising recognition, emerging from a world we often imagine as completely dismissive of women's bodily experience. But as we settle into this more carefully, a familiar pattern begins to emerge. Recognition did not necessarily mean freedom. Acknowledgement did not necessarily mean autonomy. And what appears, from a distance, like validation, often turns out to be something much more conditional. Because medieval discussions of female pleasure did not exist primarily to explore women's personal experience. They existed to explain the body in ways that supported larger systems of reproduction, legitimacy, and social order. That difference, once again, changes everything. Some medical theories inherited from classical traditions suggested that conception required active contribution from both partners, that the body did not simply receive, but responded. In certain frameworks, female physical arousal was thought to play a role in successful reproduction. This meant that female pleasure, or at least female bodily response, was not always ignored in medical writing. It was discussed, described, interpreted, placed into explanatory theories. And to modern ears, this can sound surprisingly direct. After all, here is a medieval intellectual tradition acknowledging that women had bodily experience connected to intimacy, that women were not entirely imagined as passive vessels, that something about female response mattered. But now, let us look more closely, because the key question is not simply what was acknowledged, it is why. And the answer reveals the limits immediately. Female pleasure was not treated as something valuable in its own right. It was not framed as personal fulfillment, not as mutual intimacy, not as bodily autonomy, not as pleasure-deserving recognition because women were individuals with their own inner experiences. Instead, it was treated as function, as part of reproductive theory, as something significant because of what it might contribute to conception. This distinction is subtle, but profound. A woman's experience was recognized, not primarily for her sake, but because society needed to explain how children were produced. The body became something to understand because reproduction mattered, not because female pleasure itself was seen as a sphere of personal meaning deserving freedom. And once again, something deeply personal was absorbed into a larger system. A woman's body became a subject of interpretation, a process to be explained, a mechanism to be understood, its responses observed not through the language of individual experience, but through the language of social function. And this is where medieval thought reveals its familiar contradiction. Recognition without liberation, knowledge without autonomy, description without personal freedom. Medical texts could discuss bodily processes in surprisingly direct terms, but these discussions often remained clinical, detached, theoretical. They described bodies as systems, processes, functions, conditions that produced outcomes. They did not ask what women felt emotionally. They did not center women's inner experience as something valuable on its own terms. The body appeared, but the person inside the body often remained secondary. This creates a peculiar distance. Imagine being acknowledged, but only in relation to what your body can produce. Imagine having your experience recognized, but only insofar as it serves explanation, reproduction, or social order. This is not the same as erasure, but neither is it freedom. It is something in between. A partial recognition absorbed into a system that still defines meaning from the outside. Marriage reinforced this pattern. Even where female bodily response was theoretically acknowledged, intimacy within marriage remained tied to reproduction and duty. Pleasure, if recognized, did not become a separate moral category of mutual exploration or shared emotional meaning. It remained connected to function, a part of the reproductive logic of marriage, another mechanism within the larger structure. And because of this, acknowledgement did not transform women's lived experience in the way modern readers might initially imagine. A medical theory saying that female response mattered in conception did not suddenly produce marriages built around female comfort. It did not create social equality. It did not undo expectations of obedience, reproduction, family duty, or bodily control. Ideas can exist within systems without changing those systems fundamentally. And this is precisely what makes medieval discussions of female pleasure so complex. The concept existed, but inside boundaries, recognized, but contained, discussed, but interpreted by structures outside the individual. The everyday reality for most women likely remained shaped far more by marriage expectations, family obligations, limited bodily autonomy, and uneven access to knowledge than by theoretical medical ideas circulating in learned texts. Knowledge itself was unevenly distributed. What scholars wrote was not necessarily what ordinary people understood in daily life. Ideas filtered imperfectly through society. Some women learned from mothers, relatives, midwives, whispered advice, fragments of communal knowledge. Others entered marriage with little clarity at all. Theory and lived experience were not the same thing. This created yet another gap. What was written, and what was lived? What was theoretically acknowledged, and what was emotionally experienced? And because open discussion remained limited in many contexts, female pleasure became something oddly suspended between presence and silence, known in theory, rarely centered in personal discourse, recognized in certain explanatory systems, not necessarily validated in everyday emotional life. It existed, but without full social language around it. This ambiguity shaped everything. A woman might live inside a body medieval theory partially acknowledged, yet still inhabit a society that interpreted that body through expectations not of personal fulfillment, but of marriage, fertility, lineage, and propriety. Her experience could be discussed in abstract theory, while remaining deeply constrained in lived reality. And this is perhaps one of the most revealing truths about the medieval body. It was not simply ignored. It was actively interpreted. But interpretation is not neutral. Interpretation serves purposes. And medieval bodily knowledge often served the purposes of order, reproduction, inheritance, and social continuity. The body mattered, because the system needed it to function. And once a body becomes socially functional, its personal meanings can become secondary. This is what makes medieval discussions of female pleasure feel so contradictory from a modern perspective. There is no simple story here. Not total denial. Not meaningful liberation. Not pure silence. Not open acceptance. Something more layered. More uneasy. A world where female bodily response could be acknowledged, and yet immediately redirected into explanations that kept it contained within purpose. Pleasure existed, but not as a free category of personal meaning. It existed because it fit into a theory, because it explained reproduction, because it supported larger social logic. And perhaps that is the quiet sadness in this particular historical contradiction. To be recognized, but only conditionally. To have experience acknowledged, but only in service of something beyond oneself. To exist inside knowledge, yet remain constrained by what that knowledge was allowed to mean. And as we move deeper, this logic becomes even more striking, because medieval society did not merely theorize about bodies in abstract ways. In legal disputes, inheritance questions, marriage conflicts, and medical writings, bodily processes could be discussed with surprising directness, not because the society was open in a modern sense, but because certainty mattered. And certainty, in medieval life, could determine property, legitimacy, family continuity, and power itself. Which means what comes next is not about private experience alone, but about how bodies became evidence inside the machinery of law and inheritance. Section 8. Bodies, Law, and Inheritance. Now, let us move into another unexpected corner of the medieval world, one that often surprises modern readers precisely because it seems, at first glance, so direct. Because medieval society could be silent about intimacy in one setting, and startlingly explicit in another. Not because it was suddenly open in the modern sense, not because personal experience had become something freely discussed, but because there were moments when bodies became legally important. And once that happened, silence could give way to precision. The medieval world was, above all, a society deeply concerned with continuity. Land passed through families. Titles moved through bloodlines. Property followed inheritance. Power depended on legitimacy. Marriage created legal relationships. Children carried rights. And because so much depended on who belonged to whom, bodily matters could no longer remain entirely private when disputes arose. This is where the language of intimacy becomes strangely practical, not romantic, not emotional, not personal in the modern sense. Practical, functional, legal. The body became relevant because outcomes mattered. Was a marriage valid? Had it been consummated? Could children follow? Was an heir legitimate? Could inheritance pass without dispute? Did a union produce lawful descendants? Questions like these were not abstract. They could determine wealth, family survival, political alliances, property rights, social standing, even local power. And because of this, bodily processes could enter formal discussion with a level of clarity that can feel surprising to modern ears. Not because medieval society had suddenly become comfortable discussing private experience for its own sake, but because legal systems require definitions. A vague silence is difficult to use in a courtroom. An inheritance dispute demands more than moral abstraction. A contested marriage requires facts, or at least socially accepted evidence. A family seeking legitimacy needs clarity. And so, bodies entered law. Marriage itself illustrates this immediately. A marriage was not simply an emotional union blessed by ceremony. It was a legal and social structure with consequences. Questions about whether a marriage had truly been completed could matter in disputes over annulment, inheritance, legitimacy, and property. If a union had not been physically consummated, that fact could carry legal significance in certain contexts. And suddenly, intimate bodily matters became relevant not as personal experience, but as evidence. Notice what has happened here. Something deeply private has been pulled into public consequence. The marriage bed becomes connected to law. Bodies become connected to documentation. Physical experience becomes tied to social structure. And once again, medieval life reminds us that personal intimacy was rarely treated as fully separate from larger systems. Medical writings operated in a similar way. Satan texts attempted to explain bodily processes with surprising directness, discussing reproduction, conception, bodily response, fertility, and conditions believed to affect successful pregnancy. At first glance, this can look like openness. But once again, the purpose matters. The goal was not emotional exploration. It was explanation, prediction, function, a need to understand how bodies produced outcomes society depended upon. And because reproduction sat at the center of inheritance systems, bodily knowledge acquired practical urgency. A family line could rise or collapse depending on heirs. Property could shift based on legitimacy. Titles could pass or be contested. Wealth could fracture. All of this made reproduction more than a biological event. It became structural, political, economic, social. And once reproduction carries that kind of weight, the body itself becomes something society feels compelled to interpret. This is why medieval discussions of conception could become surprisingly detailed. Theories about fertility, the role of male and female contribution, conditions believed to affect pregnancy, bodily responses interpreted through inherited medical traditions. Again, not because the society centered personal experience, but because outcomes mattered. A child was not simply a child. A child might be an heir, a continuation of property lines, a stabilizer of family continuity, a legal answer to questions of succession, or, in the absence of certainty, a source of conflict. And conflict could be dangerous. Inheritance disputes were not minor inconveniences in medieval life. They could fracture families, trigger lawsuits, destabilize alliances, create rival claims, threaten political arrangements, disrupt economic security. This meant that uncertainty around reproduction carried consequences far beyond the household. And so, bodily certainty became socially valuable. Or at least, societies tried to create the illusion of certainty where biology itself could not always provide it. Because here, my dear friends, we reach one of the quiet anxieties sitting beneath so much medieval concern. No one could truly see lineage with absolute certainty. No blood tests, no genetic proof, no scientific confirmation of parentage, only social assumptions, timing, marriage, reputation, observation, honor, and collective belief. This made the body a site of both practical importance and deep uncertainty. And uncertainty is something medieval systems disliked intensely, because uncertainty threatens order. If parentage becomes doubtful, inheritance becomes unstable. If inheritance becomes unstable, families fracture. Property claims weaken. Titles become contested. Power shifts unpredictably. A private relationship can suddenly create public consequences. This explains why medieval society devoted such extraordinary attention to legitimacy, why marriage mattered so much, why female sexual behavior was monitored so closely, why adultery carried fear beyond emotional betrayal, why virginity became symbolic, why consummation mattered, why reproduction was discussed in legal and medical terms. These are not separate concerns. They are all pieces of the same structural anxiety. Who belongs where? Who inherits what? Whose child is this? Whose bloodline continues? Whose claim is legitimate? The body became central because the system rested on answers to these questions. And yet, the body itself remained imperfectly knowable. Private acts could not always be witnessed. Desire could move in secret. Pregnancy could reveal outcomes without revealing certainty. Rumor could complicate trust. Time could create doubt. And suddenly, something deeply intimate became legally explosive. This is why medieval discussions of bodily response, fertility, and consummation can sometimes feel oddly clinical. They are not discussing bodies because society has become emotionally open. They are discussing bodies because law and inheritance demand explanation, because ambiguity creates risk, because the body has become evidence in a world desperate for stability. And evidence, in medieval society, was often incomplete. This created a strange duality. On one hand, bodily matters could be discussed with surprising directness in formal settings. On the other, personal emotional experience remained secondary. A woman's bodily response might matter in reproductive theory. A marriage bed might matter in legal disputes. A pregnancy might matter in inheritance claims. But these discussions still revolved around function, outcome, legitimacy, property, order, not personal inner experience. And this distinction remains essential. The body was not openly discussed because medieval society celebrated bodily autonomy. It was discussed because society needed bodies to produce predictable results, to generate heirs, to secure inheritance, to stabilize families, to reduce uncertainty. Knowledge served structure. This is what makes medieval bodily discourse feel so paradoxical. Direct, but constrained. Precise, but impersonal. Acknowledging physical reality, while still subordinating it to systems larger than the individual. And perhaps nowhere does this tension become more emotionally charged than when certainty itself is threatened. Because if lineage depends on trust, if inheritance depends on legitimacy, if family power depends on uncontested descent, then any private act that introduces doubt becomes more than personal misconduct. It becomes structural danger. And that, my dear friends, leads us toward one of medieval society's deepest fears. Not simply betrayal, but uncertainty itself. Because what comes next is not merely about adultery as a broken relationship, but adultery as a threat to property, lineage, legitimacy, and power. Section 9. Adultery and the Fear of Uncertainty. Now, let us move into one of the medieval world's most revealing anxieties, a subject that, in modern life, is often understood primarily through emotion. Adultery. Today, when people speak of adultery, the language usually turns toward heartbreak, betrayal, broken trust, emotional pain, damaged relationships. It is seen, above all, as something deeply personal. A rupture between individuals, a wound-inside intimacy. And while medieval people were certainly not incapable of jealousy, anger, humiliation, or emotional pain, the society around them often understood adultery through a much larger and more structural lens. Because in the medieval world, adultery was not feared only because someone's feelings might be hurt. It was feared because it introduced uncertainty, and uncertainty, in a society built on inheritance, lineage, and legitimacy, could become profoundly dangerous. To understand this, we must remember something essential. Marriage in the medieval world was not simply a romantic partnership. It was a social structure, a legal arrangement, a reproductive institution, a mechanism for transferring land, wealth, family identity, alliances, titles, and continuity from one generation to the next. And once that is true, intimacy stops being purely private, because intimacy can produce children, and children, in medieval society, did not arrive into a neutral world. They entered systems of inheritance. A child born within marriage was expected to carry rights, a name, a lineage, a place within family succession. Property might pass through that child. Titles might pass through that child. Family continuity might depend on that child. Entire estates, political relationships, and economic futures could rest upon who counted as a legitimate heir. Now, imagine what happens when certainty enters doubt. Imagine a married woman suspected of intimacy outside marriage. Suddenly, the question is no longer only moral. It becomes structural. If a child is born, whose child is that child? Whose bloodline continues? Whose property rights become activated? Whose inheritance becomes legitimate? Whose family line is truly being extended? These questions could destabilize far more than a marriage. They could destabilize systems of ownership and power. This is why adultery in medieval life often carried such intense social fey. Not because people were uniquely prudish, not because morality existed in isolation, but because private relationships could create public consequences of extraordinary magnitude. A single uncertainty in lineage could ripple outward into property disputes, family conflict, inheritance challenges, succession crises, broken alliances, even violence in some circumstances. A private act could destabilize an entire structure. And because of this, adultery was not simply treated as emotional betrayal. It became a threat to certainty itself. This helps explain why medieval concern over adultery often focused so heavily on women. This imbalance is one of the clearest signs of how inheritance logic shaped morality. A married man engaging in sexual activity outside marriage certainly could face criticism, moral condemnation, or scandal, but his behavior did not create the same uncertainty about legitimate heirs within his wife's household. A married woman, however, could. Her body became the point at which lineage either remained clear or entered doubt. And because lineage mattered so deeply, women often carried the heavier burden of surveillance, suspicion, and consequence. This was not merely about personal morality. It was about social architecture. The body became a site where certainty had to be protected. Control followed naturally from that fey. Communities watched behavior. Families limited opportunities for unsupervised contact. Interactions were interpreted carefully. Reputation mattered enormously. Rumors could damage trust even without evidence. Because in matters of lineage, suspicion alone could become destabilizing. A whisper might be enough to poison certainty. And certainty, once poisoned, is difficult to restore. This created a world in which appearances became almost as important as reality itself. Not only must one avoid impropriety, one must avoid situations that looked improper. A private conversation, a visit too long, an unexplained absence, a pattern noticed by neighbors, a rumor repeated often enough to feel believable. In closely connected medieval communities, these things mattered, because trust in lineage depended partly on social confidence, not scientific proof. No DNA, no genetic testing, no laboratory certainty, only marriage, timing, honor, observation, reputation, belief, collective agreement that the child belonged where society said the child belonged, and adultery threatened that agreement. This is what gives medieval concern over adultery its distinctive intensity. The issue was not simply desire outside marriage. It was uncertainty entering inheritance systems, private conduct creating legal instability, intimacy threatening property, emotion threatening structure. And once again, The body becomes entangled in systems far larger than personal experience. Legal records reflect this concern in striking ways. Questions around legitimacy could become matters of dispute. Who had rights? Who inherited? Who belonged within a lineage? Was a marriage valid? Were children lawful heirs? These were not sentimental questions. They could determine fortunes, land ownership, family power, political succession, economic survival, and because of this, adultery could never be understood simply as a private matter. Its consequences extended outward. This does not mean emotional betrayal was irrelevant. Certainly not. Jealousy, humiliation, anger, wounded pride, these are ancient human experiences. People in the Middle Ages felt them as people do in every age. A betrayed spouse was not merely a legal participant in an inheritance dispute. A husband or wife could feel pain, rage, grief, humiliation. Human emotion did not vanish beneath social structure. But medieval society often placed structural concern above emotional language. The system asked not first, how does this betrayal feel? But, what does this uncertainty threaten? And that difference changes the emotional framing entirely. Adultery became not merely a broken promise, but a destabilizing force, a private act capable of unsettling legitimacy itself. This also explains why punishment, shame, and moral condemnation often attached so strongly to the issue, because medieval societies were not responding only to personal betrayal. They were defending systems of order, trying to restore certainty where doubt had entered, trying to protect inheritance lines, trying to preserve family stability, trying to keep social trust intact. Of course, none of this eliminated adultery. Rules rarely erase human behavior. Attraction still appeared in inconvenient places. Unhappy marriages still existed. Secret relationships still formed. People took risks. People hid things. People lied. People justified. People loved the wrong person. People acted against expectation. Human life, as always, continued beneath rules designed to contain it. And this is where medieval society reveals its familiar contradiction once more. Control increased, but uncertainty never disappeared. Reputation mattered, but rumors could still spread. Marriage structured behavior, but private desire still moved where it should not. Lineage depended on certainty, but certainty itself remained fragile. This made adultery uniquely frightening, because unlike many sins, its consequences could linger physically. A child, a question no one could answer with certainty, a doubt that might sit inside a family line for generations, a private act becoming historical consequence. And perhaps this is what makes medieval fear of adultery feel so much larger than modern romantic imagination expects. It was not merely about a broken heart. It was about destabilized trust at every level. Between spouses, between families, between law and inheritance, between appearance and reality, between social certainty and biological uncertainty. Adultery was feared because it introduced a question medieval society desperately wanted answered, and often could not answer with certainty. And once that becomes clear, another contradiction begins to emerge. Because for all this fear, for all this surveillance, for all this moral warning, medieval society did not eliminate sexual behavior outside accepted boundaries. In fact, in some places, it quietly made room for it in ways that seem startlingly pragmatic. And that, my dear friends, leads us into another shadowed corner of medieval life. Because what comes next is not about hidden scandal, but about something surprisingly visible. Prostitution, and the strange, uneasy ways medieval society sometimes tolerated what it officially condemned. Section 10. Prostitution and Everyday Contradictions. Now, let us move into one of the most quietly unsettling contradictions in medieval society, a subject that forces us to confront, perhaps more clearly than anywhere else, the distance between official morality and practical reality. Prostitution. At first glance, it seems like something medieval society should have rejected entirely. After all, Here was a world saturated with sermons about sin, moral instruction about bodily conduct, religious warnings about temptation, and social structures designed to contain desire within marriage. A society so deeply concerned with sexual order should, in theory, have left no room at all for something like prostitution. And yet, history rarely obeys theory, because in many medieval towns and growing cities, prostitution was not always hidden in the way modern imagination expects. It could exist in forms that were known, recognized, sometimes regulated, sometimes tolerated uneasily, sometimes pushed into specific districts or managed under local authority, not embraced morally, but acknowledged practically. And immediately, a question arises. How could a society that condemned sexual sin also tolerate prostitution in visible forms? The answer reveals something important about medieval life. Because moral systems, however powerful, often coexist with practical compromises. And prostitution became one of the clearest examples of that uneasy coexistence. Official teaching often condemned sexual behavior outside marriage. The moral framework remained intact. The language of sin did not dissipate, but towns, authorities, and communities also had to deal with human behavior as it actually existed, not simply as sermons wished it to exist. And in that gap between doctrine and lived reality, a strange kind of pragmatism sometimes emerged. In certain places, prostitution was treated not as morally acceptable, but as something difficult to eliminate entirely, a tolerated imperfection, a managed vice, something kept visible enough to monitor, yet morally distant enough to condemn. This contradiction can feel jarring to modern ears, but it tells us a great deal about how medieval societies actually functioned. Because once again, we see a pattern we have encountered before. Official rule on one side, practical accommodation on the other, public condemnation, quiet tolerance, moral language, administrative reality. The contradiction did not vanish. It simply became part of daily life. Some authorities believed, however uneasily, that allowing prostitution in controlled ways might prevent other kinds of social disorder. Not because they approved of it in a moral sense, but because they believed human desire would seek outlets regardless of official teaching. This logic feels uncomfortable, perhaps cynical, but it reflects something medieval societies repeatedly encountered. Rules could shape behavior, but they could not erase impulse entirely. And so, rather than imagining prostitution as existing only in hidden shadows, we sometimes find it sitting in a strange social space. Visible, but disapproved. Known, but morally suspect. Present, but never fully accepted. This tells us something essential. Medieval society did not always function by eliminating contradiction. It often functioned by containing contradiction, pushing it into recognizable spaces, managing it, naming it, keeping it socially distinct, treating it as morally undesirable, yet practically real. And this is where prostitution becomes historically revealing, because it shows us that medieval concern with sexual order was not simply about purity in the abstract. It was also about control, containment, predictability, managing human behavior in ways authorities believed would reduce broader instability. Even vice, in this framework, could become something to regulate. Women involved in prostitution occupied a particularly difficult social position. They were visible, but stigmatized, necessary to certain urban realities, yet morally mocked, present in society, but not fully respectable within it. Their existence reveals another painful contradiction. A society could use their presence as part of practical social management, while simultaneously treating them as symbols of moral danger. This created lives lived in a space of ambiguity, known by communities, sometimes taxed or regulated by authorities, sometimes tolerated by towns, yet burdened with stigma that could be severe. And here again, gendered imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. Male participation in prostitution as clients often existed within a different moral and social logic than the women, whose bodies became the visible site of the transaction. The woman carried visibility, public moral labeling, social consequence. The man, depending on context, often moved more quietly through the same system. This imbalance reflects a broader pattern we have already seen throughout medieval life. Female bodies became the visible point where social anxieties gathered. Honor, virginity, legitimacy, reputation, temptation, vice, purity, transgression. Again and again, the body of the woman became the symbolic surface upon which larger social concerns were projected, and prostitution intensified this dynamic dramatically. Urban growth made these contradictions even more apparent. As towns expanded, anonymity increased slightly compared to tightly knit rural villages. Markets grew. Travelers passed through. Economic exchange became more complex. Trainee populations created conditions where prostitution could become part of urban life in recognizable ways. Authorities could not simply pretend such activity did not exist. And so, management emerged where elimination failed. Specific areas, rules, periodic crackdowns, taxation in some contexts, regulation of movement, attempts to contain rather than erase. The moral contradiction remained unresolved, but administratively manageable. This should not be mistaken for acceptance. Prostitution was rarely treated as a morally neutral profession in medieval Christian society. Sermons continued. Warnings continued. Stigma continued. Women associated with it could face exclusion, vulnerability, exploitation, and deep social judgment. Tolerance was often practical, not respectful, and that distinction matters profoundly, because practical tolerance without social dignity is not freedom. It is merely managed marginalization. The emotional realities of those involved are difficult to reconstruct fully. Historical records rarely preserve private inner lives with fairness. Authorities speak more loudly than individuals. Law survives more easily than emotion. Regulation survives more easily than memory. And so, much remains shadowed. But what can be seen clearly is the contradiction itself. A society that condemned certain behavior, yet made space for it. A moral order that insisted on sexual restraint, yet quietly managed visible exceptions. A public ideal, and a practical reality that refused to dissipate. This contradiction also reveals something about medieval attitudes toward male desire. In some strands of thought, prostitution was tolerated not because it was considered good, but because male sexual impulse was treated as something socially dangerous if left unmanaged. Again, not equality, not mutual understanding, but a framework in which women's bodies could become instruments in the containment of male behavior. This logic is deeply unsettling to modern readers, and rightly so. Yet it reveals the practical mechanics beneath moral language. Medieval societies were not always asking, how do we create moral purity? Sometimes they were asking, how do we prevent greater disorder? And the answers they arrived at were often ethically contradictory. This is what makes prostitution such a revealing subject, because it tears away the illusion that medieval morality operated with simple consistency. Instead, we find compromise, pragmatism, containment, public condemnation paired with quiet accommodation, human behavior managed, but never fully erased, vice made visible, but socially segregated, a society speaking one language officially, and another administratively. And perhaps this is the deeper truth hidden here. Medieval society was not a machine of perfect moral enforcement. It was a human society, full of contradiction, compromise, anxiety, and practical adaptation. Rules existed. Desire persisted. Systems condemned behavior, then created ways to manage the fact that the behavior continued anyway. This is not moral simplicity. It is complexity wearing the mask of certainty. And as we move deeper still, another surprising layer begins to emerge. Because prostitution was only one visible form of intimacy outside accepted norms. What comes next is quieter, more hidden, and perhaps even more revealing. Because beneath marriage, beneath prostitution, beneath moral law and public reputation, There remained private desires that did not fit neatly into any accepted structure at all. Section 11. Private desires beyond accepted structures. Now, let us move into one of the quietest and most difficult parts of medieval life, a space where the written record becomes thinner, more fragmented, more cautious, and where silence itself begins to tell a story. Because not every form of desire fit neatly into marriage. Not every intimacy followed accepted patterns. Not every private attachment could be folded into the structures medieval society understood how to regulate. And once we enter this shadowed territory, we begin to see something that history often struggles to preserve clearly. Human longing, in forms that did not always have safe places to exist. The medieval world was built around structures: marriage, inheritance, family continuity, religious morality, gender roles, social expectation. These structures provided order, at least in theory. They told people where intimacy should happen, why it should happen, what purpose it should serve, who should participate, what outcomes were expected: a husband and wife, children, family continuity, legitimacy, inheritance, social stability. Everything, in theory, had a place. But human life, as we have seen again and again, rarely fits perfectly into structures. People feel things in unexpected directions. Attachment forms where it should not. Desire appears outside approved boundaries. Affection grows in places society has no language for. Longing takes shapes that official systems do not know how to accommodate. And when this happens, silence often follows. Not because the feelings do not exist, but because society lacks safe ways to acknowledge them. This is one of the hardest truths historians face. Absence in the record does not necessarily mean absence in life. Sometimes it means danger. Sometimes it means secrecy. Sometimes it means people learn not to speak openly. The medieval world preserved vast amounts of moral instruction about what should happen. Far less survives about private emotional realities that did not fit those expectations. And yet, traces remain. Fragments, court records, accusations, religious condemnations, letters in rare cases, stories told indirectly, poetry whose meanings hovered just beneath literal language, friendships described with unusual intensity, scandals hinted at but never fully explained, silences where something seems to press against the limits of what can safely be said. This does not give us a complete map. History here becomes uncertain, but uncertainty itself tells us something. Because societies do not create rules against possibilities that no one imagines. Moral warnings reveal anxieties. Condemnations reveal awareness. Anxious language often points toward realities authorities fear, even when lived experience remains partially hidden. Same-sex intimacy, for example, appears in medieval records largely through the language of prohibition, accusation, or moral judgment. This makes interpretation difficult, because what survives most clearly are the voices of authority, not the voices of those who lived such experiences privately, and that creates a distortion. We hear the warning, but rarely the heartbeat behind it. We see the rule, but not always the private life that made the rule necessary. And yet, human history offers a simple truth. People have always felt more than societies knew how to organize. Always. Medieval people were no exception. Affection between individuals could become emotionally intense in ways not always easy to categorize neatly through modern language. Friendships, companionships, spiritual bonds, emotional attachments, private relationships, these existed inside cultures whose categories were not identical to ours. This makes interpretation delicate. One must avoid forcing modern labels too quickly. And yet, one must also avoid imagining that medieval people were emotionally simpler than human beings in any other century. They were not. They loved, desired, longed, grieved, attached themselves deeply to others, sometimes in ways society approved, sometimes in ways society watched nervously, sometimes in ways that remained hidden beneath the language available to them. Silence here becomes part of the story, because when a society has no safe public structure for certain forms of intimacy, private life often retreats into secrecy, coded behavior, guarded companionship, silence, or invisibility. Not because feeling disappears, but because expression becomes dangerous. This creates one of the quiet tragedies of historical interpretation. Lives may have existed richly, but left only shadows. Emotions may have mattered profoundly, but survived only as accusations and hostile records. Affections may have shaped entire inner worlds, but appear to us now only in fragments too delicate to interpret with certainty. And this reminds us again. History preserves power more easily than privacy. Rules survive. Condemnations survive. Laws survive. Warnings survive. The intimate inner life of ordinary people often does not. And yet, even within this silence, something can still be sensed. The medieval world did not erase human complexity. It simply made some kinds of complexity harder to live openly. Private desires that did not fit marriage, did not produce heirs, did not support inheritance, did not strengthen family structures, often became socially difficult precisely because the system had no useful place for them. Remember, medieval society repeatedly interpreted intimacy through purpose, marriage, children, legitimacy, lineage, inheritance, continuity. When desire moved outside those purposes, it became harder for society to understand within its existing logic. This did not make desire disappear. It made it harder to speak, harder to legitimize, harder to preserve in the historical record. And here, once again, we encounter that familiar medieval contradiction. Human feeling on one side, social structure on the other, not always aligned, not always reconcilable. Private life pressing quietly against systems built for something else. This includes not only same-sex intimacy, but many forms of attachment and desire that simply did not fit the expected script. Affairs built around emotional longing rather than inheritance. Private passions that defied arranged marriages. Unspoken attachments inside monasteries or courts. Relationships shaped by affection rather than utility. Bonds hidden beneath friendship language. Private desires carried silently because there was nowhere safe to place them. The medieval world, for all its structures, remained inhabited by human beings whose inner lives were often larger than the categories available to them. And perhaps this is one of the most haunting truths in all of this. To live with feeling, but without language. To love, but without legitimacy. To desire, but without safe recognition. To know something deeply in oneself, while living in a world that offers no place for that knowledge to stand openly. This is not unique to the Middle Ages, of course. Human history has always contained such lives. But in medieval society, where intimacy was so tightly tied to social function, the tension could become especially sharp, because the system kept asking, what purpose does this serve? Whose lineage does this protect? What inheritance does this secure? What family order does this strengthen? And some desires, some forms of intimacy, had no acceptable answer to offer. They existed anyway, quietly, privately, sometimes joyfully, sometimes painfully, sometimes hidden so well that history can only glimpse them through shadows. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson, hey? The medieval world was never simply a place of rules. It was a place of people, trying to live inside rules that did not always fit the shape of their inner lives. And as we move toward the next layer, another surprising contradiction awaits. Because even in a world so concerned with morality and restraint, people still joked, laughed, told stories, shared bawdy humor, turned intimacy into entertainment and social commentary in ways that feel startlingly familiar. Because what comes next is not silence at all, but laughter. Section 12. Laughter, bawdy humor, and medieval entertainment. Now, after so much talk of rules, surveillance, duty, and moral pressure, let us move somewhere that can feel unexpectedly lively. A tavern corner, a noisy marketplace, a feast hall after enough drink has softened formal restraint. A group of friends exchanging stories not meant for priests. Laughter rising in the dark. Because one of the great misconceptions about the medieval world is the belief that it was always solemn, always grim, always morally stiff, always trapped inside sermons and silence. But human beings, even under pressure, laugh. They joke about what embarrasses them. They tease what society treats too seriously. They turn fear into humor. They transform tension into story. And medieval people, for all the rules surrounding intimacy, were no exception. In fact, when one looks closely, humor becomes one of the clearest signs that sexuality was never absent from everyday awareness. Because jokes only work when people understand what lies beneath them. A sly remark only lands when listeners recognize the reference. A suggestive story only entertains when the audience already knows what is being implied. And this tells us something immediately important. Medieval people did not live in ignorance of intimate matters. They lived in a world where such matters could not always be spoken of directly in formal settings, and so often surfaced elsewhere. In laughter, in tavern talk, in songs, in comic tales, in satire, in stories told with a wink rather than a sermon. Humor, in many societies, becomes a pressure valve, a place where subjects too uncomfortable for official language find another route into conversation. And in the medieval world, bawdy humor often played exactly that role. A joke could say what polite speech avoided. A story could approach what morality condemned, without speaking in the language of law or church. A crowd could laugh together at something everyone understood, while preserving a kind of distance through comedy. And this is deeply revealing, because humor does not emerge from silence. It emerges from shared awareness. Think of the village storyteller, the wandering performer, the tavern singer, the satirical poet. The feast hall anecdote passed around after formal ceremony has given way to wine and loosened tongues. These were not priests delivering moral instruction. These were spaces where people entertained one another. And entertainment, as ever, often leaned toward what was earthy, bodily, suggestive, mischievous, full of human weakness, sexual embarrassment, marital frustration, infidelity, jealous husbands, clever wives, naive priests, unruly desire, bodies behaving in inconvenient ways. All of these became material for humor in various medieval traditions. And once again, something important becomes clear. A society that jokes repeatedly about intimacy is not a society untouched by it. It is a society thinking about it enough for everyone to recognize the joke. This does not mean medieval humor was modern in tone. Not at all. Its assumptions, gender politics, social hierarchies, and moral framing could be profoundly different. Some jokes reinforced stereotypes. Some mocked women unfairly. Some treated sexuality through social assumptions modern listeners may find uncomfortable. Some relied on inversion, making comedy by temporarily overturning normal social rules. But whatever form it took, the humor itself reveals a world not emotionally silent, but culturally alive with recognition. Take satire, for example. Medieval satire often delighted in exposing hypocrisy. A priest preaching restraint while behaving badly. A pompous moral authority undone by bodily weakness. A husband fooled. A lover caught. A respected figure revealed to be just as human as everyone else. Why were such stories funny? Because audiences recognized the tension between official morality and human behavior. The very contradiction we have been tracing all along. Comedy thrives where ideals and reality collide, and medieval life provided no shortage of such collisions. Tavern culture likely amplified this further. Alcohol, communal storytelling, song, teasing, mockery. These created social spaces where conversation loosened. Subjects treated carefully elsewhere might become comic material here, not because moral systems disappeared, but because social context changed. The same society that demanded restraint in church could laugh at earthy humor over ale. Contradiction again. Not hypocrisy necessarily, but human compartmentalization. Different spaces allowed different forms of speech. Festivals sometimes intensified this spirit even more. Certain periods of celebration created temporary loosenings of ordinary formality. Mockery, inversion, comic exaggeration, earthy songs, satirical performances, moments when social seriousness gave way, briefly, to laughter and bodily humor. Not permanent rebellion, not moral collapse, just temporary spaces where human expression became less rigid. And humor about intimacy often flourished there. This matters because it changes our emotional picture of the Middle Ages. The period was not only sermons and silence, it was also laughter in crowded halls, songs with double meanings, stories told after dark, people teasing one another with the same awkward, bodily, romantic, and sexual tensions humans joke about in every age. Different language, different assumptions, different social structures, but recognizable laughter. And laughter tells us something authority alone cannot. It reveals what ordinary people found funny, what embarrassed them, what they shared as common knowledge, what anxieties could be turned into entertainment, what social contradictions everyone recognized well enough to laugh at together. This makes humor one of history's quiet windows into everyday consciousness, because legal records tell us what authorities worried about. Religious texts tell us what moral systems demanded. But jokes tell us what ordinary people already knew, and often what they privately found absurd. The jealous husband who cannot control his household, the sanctimonious figure caught in compromise, the bodily mishap, the sexual misunderstanding, the flirtation gone wrong, the overbearing spouse, the mismatch between official virtue and human appetite. These comic patterns appear again and again in different forms because they reflect recurring human tensions, and medieval audiences understood them instantly. Which reminds us once more, desire was not absent. It was present enough to become comedy. Embarrassment was not hidden beyond imagination. It was familiar enough to make people laugh. Marital strain was not unthinkable. It was recognizable enough to become storytelling material. Even bodily processes, awkwardness, fertility anxieties, and sexual misunderstandings could become comic subjects. Not because medieval people were crude in some simplistic sense, but because bodily life was part of being human, and humans often laugh at what they cannot fully control. Humor also gave people something else. Distance. A joke allows dangerous truths to be spoken indirectly. Laughter softens what direct speech might make too uncomfortable. A satirical tale can expose hypocrisy without issuing a formal accusation. A comic song can hint at social realities polite discourse avoids. This made humor socially useful, not just entertaining. A form of commentary disguised as laughter. And this may be why medieval bawdy humor feels so revealing to modern readers, because it tears open the illusion of a society emotionally frozen beneath doctrine. Instead, we find something much livelier. People laughing about marriage, about desire, about infidelity, about bodily awkwardness, about temptation, about hypocrisy, about the strange gap between rules and reality. A society morally serious, yes, but also human enough to laugh at the very tensions it could never fully resolve. And perhaps that is the softest truth hidden here tonight. Where there is laughter, there is recognition. Where there is joke, there is shared knowledge. Where there is satire, there is awareness beneath official language. And medieval people, beneath the heavy structures of duty and morality, were still people sitting together in taverns, halls, kitchens, and marketplaces, laughing at the same ancient human embarrassments that have followed our species across centuries. But laughter, of course, was only one way intimacy entered everyday life, because beyond jokes and stories, there remained the physical realities of the body itself. Bathing, privacy, cleanliness, crowded households, shared spaces, the simple daily fact of living inside a human body in a world very different from our own. And that, my dear friends, is where we go next. Section 13. Bathhouses, privacy, and everyday intimacy. Now, let us leave behind the tavern laughter for a moment and step into something quieter. Not a courtroom, not a marriage chamber, not a sermon, but ordinary daily life. Because there's another misconception about the medieval world that lingers stubbornly in modern imagination. The belief that medieval people somehow lived in total physical ignorance of the body, deity, detached, uncomfortable with bodily reality, untouched by routines of cleanliness or physical awareness. But history, as always, asks us to slow down and look again, because people in the Middle Ages still woke each morning inside bodies that sweated, bodies that aged, bodies that needed washing, tending, touching, healing, covering, feeding, bodies that existed not as abstract symbols in religious teaching, but as daily physical realities. And once we begin looking at bodily life, something fascinating happens. We start to see how intimacy in the medieval world was shaped not only by morality, but by architecture, routine, privacy, bathing, shared spaces, and the simple physical fact that people often lived far closer to one another than modern people do. Let us begin with privacy, or rather, the medieval experience of limited privacy. Modern life trains us to think of privacy as normal. A bathroom behind a locked door, a bedroom belonging to one person or one couple, private dressing, private bathing, private routines, personal bodily life hidden from public sight. But medieval households often worked differently. Homes could be crowded, multiple generations under one roof, servants sleeping nearby, children everywhere, shared domestic space, thin partitions, common rooms serving many functions, people dressing, sleeping, eating, working, and living in physical proximity that would feel startlingly intimate to modern sensibilities. This did not mean that privacy never existed. Of course it did. But it often existed in fragments, moments, temporary separations, social understandings rather than architectural guarantees. And this changes how bodily life feels. Because when people live close together, awareness of one another becomes unavoidable. The sound of movement, shared sleeping arrangements in some circumstances, communal routines, domestic rhythms where bodily life is less hidden simply because space does not allow total concealment. This does not mean medieval people lacked modesty. Quite the opposite. Ideas about modesty could be strong, but modesty existed within physical realities that often allowed less isolation than modern life provides. This meant that intimacy, embarrassment, bodily awareness, and personal boundaries operated inside a different spatial logic. And then, there's bathing. Here too, modern myth often misleads. The old caricature imagines medieval people as uniformly filthy, somehow uninterested in washing, cleanliness, or bodily comfort. But this picture is far too simple. Bathing existed. Washing existed. Ideas of bodily cleanliness existed, though they varied by class, period, region, season, resources, and local custom. People washed faces, hands, bodies as circumstances allowed. Linen clothing played a role in bodily hygiene. Bathhouses existed in many towns and cities at various times. Private washing occurred in homes when means allowed. The medieval body was not unknown to soap, water, or care. It was simply embedded in different practical realities than our own. Public bathhouses are especially interesting. To modern minds, they can seem unexpectedly intimate. Shared bathing spaces, bodies present in communal settings, a social institution centered around washing, warmth, conversation, bodily care. Depending on time and place, bathhouses could function in different ways, some practical, some social, some morally controversial. People came not merely to wash, but sometimes to gather, relax, converse, occupy shared urban space. And once again, the medieval relationship to bodily visibility becomes more complex than modern stereotypes suggest. Bodies were not always hidden in the same ways we assume. Context mattered. Social expectation mattered. Custom mattered. Class mattered. Moral anxiety mattered. Bathhouses themselves sometimes attracted suspicion precisely because bodily proximity, sociability, and sexuality could blur in the eyes of authorities. And this reveals something fascinating. The body was never simply absent from public awareness. It existed in shared spaces, managed spaces, moralized spaces, practical spaces. The medieval world did not ignore the body. It negotiated it. This also means that bodily familiarity could differ from modern assumptions. In a world of shared domestic space, communal labor, childbirth at home, sickness treated in intimate proximity, bathing practices varying across contexts, and limited architectural privacy, the body could be simultaneously ordinary and morally charged, visible in some contexts, heavily regulated in others, practical one moment, symbolic the next. And this duality shaped intimacy profoundly. Consider the simple act of dressing. In a modern home, this is often a deeply private routine. In many medieval circumstances, privacy may have been partial, negotiated, socially managed rather than absolute. Children present, servants assisting elite households, family members sharing sleeping space. Bodies becoming part of domestic reality in ways modern architecture has largely hidden from us. Again, not a lack of modesty, but a different structure of bodily life. This matters because intimacy does not occur in abstraction. It occurs in physical environments, and medieval environments shape the emotional texture of bodily experience in ways modern people often underestimate. Marriage, desire, embarrassment, attraction, bodily care, all unfolded in spaces where total isolation was often rare. This could make privacy precious, moments alone valuable, time together carefully managed, intimacy negotiated not just through feeling, but through architecture and routine. The body itself was also understood through practical care, herbal remedies, midwives, household knowledge, heat, cold, hormonal theories, diet linked to bodily balance, fertility concerns, childbirth practices, sexual health understood through the medical frameworks available at the time. The body was not ignored. It was interpreted, sometimes incorrectly by modern standards, slightingly, but actively tended, explained, worried over, and woven into everyday life. And perhaps this is what feels most surprising once the caricature begins to dissolve. Medieval bodily life was not a world of total silence and neglect. It was a world of closeness, crowded domesticity, shared physical realities, partial privacy, bathing cultures in some places, bodily care shaped by available knowledge, bodies visible in certain practical contexts, yet morally charged in others. The medieval person still inhabited flesh in daily, ordinary, unavoidable ways. Sweat in summer, cold in winter, illness, fertility, aging, birth, desire, embarrassment, washing, dressing, sleeping near others, living bodily life not in abstract privacy, but in close physical community. And this changes our understanding of intimacy yet again. Because intimacy is not only about morality or desire, it is also about space, walls, doors, routine, crowded rooms, bathing customs, household rhythms, the practical logistics of bodies living near one another. And once we see this, another fascinating layer begins to emerge. Because if medieval people cared about bodies, and worried about reproduction, and carried private desires within systems of inheritance and moral control, then one question naturally follows. Did people try to influence fertility itself? Did they carry secret knowledge, whispered remedies, herbal traditions, quiet attempts to manage conception in a world deeply invested in reproduction? And that, my dear friends, is where we go next. Section 14. Contraception, fertility, and secret knowledge. Now, let us move into one of the quieter and more hidden parts of medieval life, a subject that rarely stood openly in public. It almost certainly lived in whispers, practical advice, household remedies, and private anxieties. Fertility, and more specifically, the question that follows naturally once we understand how much medieval society cared about marriage, inheritance, children, and legitimacy. Did people ever try to prevent pregnancy? Did they seek ways, however uncertain, to influence conception in a world that officially placed so much importance on reproduction? The answer, as with so much in history, is complicated. Because medieval people did not possess modern contraception. No scientific birth control in the way we understand it today. No laboratory-tested methods. No modern reproductive medicine. And yet, that does not mean people simply surrendered themselves to chance without thought. Human beings have always tried to understand fertility, always worried about conception, always sought ways to encourage it, or avoid it, always shared practical knowledge, whether accurate or not. And the medieval world was no exception. This knowledge did not usually sit in the open center of public moral life. It moved more quietly, through household traditions, through herbal law, through midwives, through women speaking privately to women, through practical knowledge passed hand to hand rather than preached from pulpits, through fragments of medical texts, folk remedies, whispered advice, and bodily theories that mixed observation with misunderstanding. Some methods aimed to encourage pregnancy, others aimed to delay it. Some were rooted in medical theory, others in superstition, others in folk tradition whose origins are difficult to trace. And this alone tells us something important. A society deeply invested in reproduction was also full of people living with private reasons to think carefully about fertility. A woman already burdened by repeated childbirth, a household struggling economically, a relationship complicated by timing, an affair where pregnancy would create disaster, a sex worker trying to reduce risk, a couple spacing children without modern language for that intention. Fear, practicality, desperation, bodily exhaustion, quiet hope, all of these could shape private choices. And once again, human reality moves beneath official structures. Medieval medical traditions often interpreted fertility through humoral theory, the belief that the body functioned through balances of heat, cold, moisture, dryness, and internal conditions. Conception, in this framework, depended not simply on the act itself, but on bodily states, timing, diet, physical balance, temperament, theories about male and female contribution, conditions believed to make conception more or less likely. Some remedies attempted to influence these factors. Herbs, preparations, physical practices, timing strategies, methods whose effectiveness ranged from uncertain to ineffective to occasionally plausible by modern retrospective guesswork. But certainty was rare. This is crucial to understand. Medieval fertility control was not science in the modern sense. It was experimentation inside imperfect knowledge. Observation mixed with theory, tradition mixed with hope, practice mixed with myth. A woman might know certain herbs were said to help prevent conception, but whether they worked, how safely, how consistently, often remained uncertain. A midwife might carry practical knowledge not written clearly in elite texts. A household might preserve remedies passed through generations. Advice might travel privately between women more than through formal public discourse. This makes fertility knowledge one of those areas where official records only tell part of the story, because learned male medical texts survive more easily than women's whispered practical traditions. Written authority survives more easily than kitchen conversation. Law survives more easily than quiet advice exchanged at a bedside. And so, much of what ordinary people knew remains partly hidden, but the fragments that do survive suggest something unmistakable. People cared deeply about managing fertility, even in worlds where official morality emphasized reproduction. This should not surprise us. Pregnancy in the medieval world was not a minor event. It could be physically dangerous. Childbirth carried risk. Maternal death was a real possibility. Infant mortality was common. Repeated pregnancies could exhaust the body. Economic strain could intensify family hardship. A pregnancy was not simply symbolic continuity. It was a bodily and social event carrying real stakes. This meant fertility was not merely a theoretical concern. It was deeply practical. A woman's body lived with consequences. And bodies, as always, respond not only to moral teaching, but to survival. This is where midwives become especially important in historical imagination. Midwives often stood at the edge between formal medicine and lived bodily reality. Birth, menstruation, pregnancy, loss, infant care, fertility concerns. Women's bodily knowledge often passed through such practical figures far more intimately than through university-trained medical authorities. And though records can be uneven, filtered, or shaped by later suspicion, it is difficult to imagine medieval women navigating reproduction without networks of shared practical advice. Not always accurate, not always safe, but real. This knowledge, however, often existed in a morally uneasy space, because fertility control could challenge expectations built around marriage and reproduction. Official religious teachings did not celebrate deliberate prevention of conception in the modern sense. And yet, private behavior rarely maps perfectly onto official teaching. We have seen this pattern again and again tonight. Rules on one side, human need on the other, doctrine, practical compromise, moral expectation, quiet bodily decision, and fertility becomes one of the clearest places where this tension lives. Because for all the official emphasis on children and family continuity, individual bodies still bore the immediate burden. The woman carrying pregnancy, the household feeding more mouths, the person fearing scandal if pregnancy revealed hidden intimacy, the sex worker navigating danger, the couple already stretched to survival. Private circumstances create private motives, and motives do not disappear simply because sermons exist. Of course, not every attempt at fertility control was effective. Far from it. Many methods were likely unreliable, some dangerous, some rooted more in symbolic thinking than biological reality. Some perhaps offered occasional practical effect by accident rather than understanding. Modern readers must resist imagining secret medieval contraception as a hidden version of modern medicine. It was not. It was uncertain, partial, experimental, often desperate. But uncertainty does not erase intent. The very existence of such efforts tells us something powerful. People did not simply accept fertility passively without thought. They worried about it, planned around it, feared it, hoped for it, tried to influence it, shared advice, carried knowledge in fragments. And this makes medieval reproductive life feel much more human and much more emotionally recognizable. Because beneath inheritance systems and moral structures, there were still individual bodies asking private questions. What if I conceive? What if I do not? What if another pregnancy comes too soon? What if a child cannot be supported? What if this reveals something dangerous? What if fertility fails altogether? These are ancient human fears, ancient human hopes, and medieval people carried them too, quietly. Sometimes with remedies in hand, sometimes with prayers, sometimes with herbal preparations, sometimes with nothing but uncertain knowledge and desperate hope. And perhaps that is the soft truth hidden here. Even in a world that framed reproduction as duty, individual people still experience fertility as something deeply personal, a burden, a blessing, a fate, a hope, a risk, a mystery. Something bodies endured, desired, dreaded, or quietly tried to influence in ways history can only partially recover. And yet, when private behavior failed to remain private, when hidden acts surfaced, when rumor became accusation, when bodies revealed secrets, medieval society could respond not with whispers, but with spectacle, punishment, scandal, public shame. And that, my dear friends, is where our story goes next. Section 15. Punishment, Scandal, and Public Shame. Now, Let us step into one of the harsher parts of medieval life, where private acts could suddenly become public events, and where intimacy, once exposed, could stop being a secret and become something far larger. Scandal. Because as long as private behavior remained private, people could negotiate, conceal, deny, confess quietly, or move within the gray spaces that existed beneath official rules. But when secrecy failed, when rumor hardened into accusation, when a pregnancy revealed what words had hidden, when witnesses spoke, when neighbors whispered too loudly, when a court became involved, the consequences could move outward very quickly. And medieval society, as we have seen, cared deeply about reputation, perhaps more deeply than modern people sometimes realize, because reputation was not merely social vanity, it was survival, marriage prospects, family standing, economic trust, business relationships, household honor, community acceptance, inheritance confidence. A damaged reputation could ripple outward through many layers of life. And once scandal entered public view, control shifted. What had once been private behavior became communal knowledge, a matter for neighbors, for clergy, for courts, for family elders, for gossip networks that remembered long after formal punishment ended. And hey, shame becomes one of medieval society's most powerful tools. Modern punishment often imagines fines, prison, legal process and bureaucratic systems. Medieval punishment could involve something more socially intimate, and in some ways, more psychologically brutal. Public humiliation, exposure, visible moral marking. Punishment not only to correct behavior, but to display it, to make example of it, to remind others what consequences looked like. This was possible because medieval communities were tightly connected. People knew one another, or believed they did. A public punishment was not performed for anonymous strangers. It unfolded before people whose opinions mattered. Neighbors, relatives, potential marriage partners, employers, local authorities, people who would remember. And memory, in such communities, could become punishment in itself. Not every accusation led to dramatic spectacle, of course. Medieval justice varied enormously across place, class, time, and circumstance. Some matters remained within church courts. Some ended in fines. Some in penance. Some in quiet settlements. Some in family negotiation. Some in legal disputes. History is too varied for one simple story. But public shame, in many contexts, remained a recurring mechanism. A person might be required to confess wrongdoing publicly, perform penance visibly, wear symbolic markers, endure public rebuke, face communal knowledge that private conduct had become moral spectacle. And once again, the body enters social meaning. A visible person carrying invisible accusation, standing before community judgment, not merely punished, but seen. Seen in disgrace. Seen in moral failure, seen as a warning. This matters because shame operates differently from private guilt. Private guilt lives inside conscience. Public shame lives in social memory. And medieval societies, where reputation mattered so deeply, understood this power well. For women, the consequences could be especially severe. A pregnancy outside marriage could make secrecy impossible. Bodies reveal what rumor alone only suggests. A child could become evidence. A visible consequence no explanation could easily erase. Reputation might shift overnight. Marriage prospects collapse. Family honor become entangled in scandal. Social trust fracture. Again, the burden of visible consequence often fell unevenly. A man involved might deny, disappear, negotiate, evade, or face consequences shaped differently, but a woman's body could carry public evidence in ways impossible to conceal. This imbalance made shame profoundly gendered. Not universally, not always, but repeatedly enough that the pattern is unmistakable. The body became social proof, and proof invited judgment. Adultery accusations could become similarly explosive. not simply because of emotional betrayal, but because public scandal threatened legitimacy, inheritance, trust, family honor, and household stability all at once. A private affair could become communal crisis. Families drawn into conflict, reputations shattered, legal questions raised, rumors turning into public narrative, and public narrative, once established, was hard to reverse. This is another reason why secrecy mattered so much in medieval life, because scandal was not merely about moral guilt. It was about exposure, visibility, loss of narrative control, the transformation of private behavior into public identity. Once people knew something about you, whether accurately or not, that knowledge could linger. Stories traveled farther than corrections. Whispers outlived facts. Memory hardened around scandal. And this is one of the harshest emotional realities of tightly connected communities. You do not simply endure punishment. You endure being remembered. This dynamic also made false accusation especially dangerous, because rumor did not always require proof to damage reputation. Suspicion could become social truth long before formal judgment arrived. A woman thought too familiar with a man. A husband publicly mocked. A priest accused. A family whispered about. Sometimes truth mattered. Sometimes perception mattered more. And perception, once spread, could shape real consequences. This made medieval life psychologically tense in ways that official records often understate. Not simply do not sin, but do not be seen. Do not be suspected. Do not become the story others tell. Do not let rumor attach itself to your name, because rumor could become a second kind of punishment, one with no clear ending. Church courts often reflected this complexity. Confession and penance could offer restoration in theory. A sinner might repent, receive guidance, perform required acts, return to moral standing. But communities do not always forget as easily as religious systems forgive. Social memory operates differently from theology. A priest may absolve. A neighbor may continue whispering for years. And this difference matters deeply. Formal punishment may end. Public identity may not. This is why medieval scandal could feel so devastating. Not only because of legal consequence, but because identity itself could change. A person becoming known for one act. A family becoming associated with one story. A woman becoming that woman. A husband becoming an object of mockery. A household becoming a source of gossip. Punishment extending beyond court into ordinary daily life. And yet, even here, contradiction remains, because societies that punished publicly also depended on quiet forgetting in many cases. Not every scandal destroyed a life. Not every accusation lasted forever. People negotiated. Communities moved on. Families repaired damage where possible. Money settled disputes. Marriage arrangements restored appearances. Private compromises buried public tensions. Human societies are rarely consistent in how they punish. Some people suffered harshly. Others escaped. Class mattered. Gender mattered. Wealth mattered. Connections mattered. The medieval world, like every world, could be uneven in its justice. But what remains unmistakable is this. Private intimacy, once exposed, could become public theater, moral drama, communal spectacle, social warning. And perhaps that is what gives medieval scandal its peculiar emotional intensity. A secret becoming visible. A private body becoming evidence. A rumor becoming reputation. A mistake becoming identity. A personal act suddenly belonging to everyone. And once again, the line between intimate life and social structure disappears. But now, my dear friends, we are nearing the quiet end of our journey. Because after marriage, desire, shame, laughter, secrecy, and contradiction, one final truth waits beneath it all. Not a new scandal, not another rule, but the deeper question that has followed us from the beginning. What did all of this really reveal about the medieval world and about human beings themselves? And that is where we go next. Section 16. The quiet truth beneath medieval morality. And now, My dear friends, as the candles burn lower and the long road of tonight's journey begins to soften into reflection, let us step back, away from the wedding chamber, away from the courtroom, away from the tavern laughter, away from the whispers, the rumors, the sermons, the rules. Let us step back and ask a quieter question. What was all of this really? What do marriage obligations, virginity, adultery, fertility fears, bathhouses, public shame, secret remedies, private desires, and whispered laughter reveal when seen together? Because at first glance, the medieval world seems like a place of control, a society built on structure, rules, hierarchy, moral certainty, clear expectations, public order, and from a distance, it can almost appear simple. People knew their roles. Religion shaped behavior. Marriage contained desire. Authority defined morality. The boundaries seem firm. The lines seem clear. The world appears ordered. But now, after walking through its quieter rooms, after listening to what official voices said and what private life whispered beneath them, that simple image becomes harder to believe, because what emerges instead is something far more human. A world not without desire, but full of desire under pressure. Not a world without intimacy, but one where intimacy rarely belonged entirely to the people experiencing it. Not a world of silence, but a world where silence itself was crowded with meaning. And perhaps this is the deepest truth waiting beneath medieval morality. Rules did not erase humanity. They shaped it, pressed against it, redirected it, forced it into smaller spaces, changed how it spoke, changed where it appeared, changed what risks it carried. But they did not remove it, because human beings remained, stubbornly, beautifully, inconveniently human. A frightened bride entering marriage under expectation, a husband carrying pressures he never names aloud, a woman fearing pregnancy, a family guarding reputation, a lover hiding what cannot be spoken, a midwife passing on secret practical knowledge, a priest hearing confessions he knows will retain, a tavern crowd laughing at hypocrisy, a household whispering rumors behind closed shutters, a person kneeling in church by day and wrestling privately with longing by night. These are not abstractions. They are people. And the more closely we look, the less medieval people resemble statues beneath stained glass, and the more they resemble us. Not because their world was the same. It was not. Their assumptions, beliefs, dangers, customs, and structures were profoundly different. Marriage carried meanings ours often does not. Bodies were tied to inheritance in ways unfamiliar to modern life. Religion shaped conscience differently. Privacy worked differently. Family obligations reached more deeply. Gender expectations could be far harsher. Social shame more intimate. Survival more precarious. And yet, beneath all of that, there remains something strangely familiar. Desire appearing where it complicates life. Love not always arriving in approved forms. Bodies creating fear and hope. Rules colliding with reality. People trying to live inside systems larger than themselves. People failing. People hiding. People laughing. People longing. People making compromises between what they believe and what they feel. This is perhaps what unsettles us most when history becomes real. We expect distance. Instead, we find recognition. Not because medieval life was modern, but because human contradiction is ancient. The medieval church could define sin, but it could not eliminate temptation. Marriage could structure intimacy, but it could not guarantee affection. Families could guard reputation, but they could not control every private choice. Authorities could punish scandal, but they could not erase desire. Rules could shape conduct, but they could not redesign the human heart. And so medieval life became what human societies so often become, a public structure, filled with private complexity, official certainty, living beside hidden contradiction, moral ideals, sharing space with compromise, secrecy, negotiation, humor, weakness, tenderness, and longing. This is not failure of history. It is history. Because human beings have never lived as perfectly as their systems imagined them. Never. Not in the Middle Ages. Not now. Not anywhere. And perhaps that is why the medieval world, once stripped of caricature, begins to feel less like a distant moral museum, and more like something quietly recognizable. A world where people still worried what others thought, still feared exposure, still wanted love where love was inconvenient, still laughed at hypocrisy, still made private choices beneath public rules, still lived inside bodies that brought desire, embarrassment, fear, fertility, pleasure, danger, and uncertainty, still carried inner lives larger than the categories available to them. And this, my dear friends, may be the softest truth of all. History often looks rigid from a distance because rules survive on paper. But people survive in fragments. A joke, a court case, a whispered accusation, a medical note, a confession, a legal dispute, a poem, a rumor, a silence that says more than a speech. And from these fragments, we slowly remember something simple. The past was never made of rules alone. It was made of people trying to live beneath them. Some obedient, some secretive, some joyful, some afraid, some lucky, some trapped, some laughing, some longing, all of them human. And so tonight, as the candles fade and the medieval streets grow quiet once more, perhaps we leave this world not with the comforting illusion that the past was simpler, but with the stranger realization that it was not. It was layered, messy, contradictory, restrained on the surface, restless underneath. A world where morality spoke loudly, and humanity whispered back. And perhaps, if we listen very carefully, across centuries of stone walls and church bells and candle smoke, that whisper sounds a little more familiar than we expected. Good night, my dear friends, and until our next quiet journey, sleep well.